This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 32. Dowley's Humiliation. Well, when that cargo arrived toward sunset Saturday afternoon, I had my hands full to keep the Marcos from fainting. They were sure Jones and I were just ruined past help, and they blamed themselves as accessories to this bankruptcy. You see, in addition to the dinner materials, which called for a sufficiently round sum, I had bought a lot of extras for the future comfort of the family. For instance, a big lot of wheat, a delicacy as rare to the tables of their class as was ice cream to a hermit's. Also a sizable deal dinner table. Also 2 entire pounds of salt, which was another piece of extravagance in those people's eyes. Also crockery, stools, the clothes, a small cask of beer, and so on. I instructed the Marcos to keep quiet about this sumptuousness, as to give me a chance to surprise the guests and show off a little. Concerning the new clothes, the simple couple were like children. They were up and down all night to see if it wasn't nearly daylight, so that they could put them on, and they were into them at last as much as an hour before dawn was due. Then their pleasure, not to say delirium, was so fresh and novel and inspiring, that the sight of it paid me well for the interruptions which my sleep had suffered. The king had slept just as usual, like the dead. The Marcos could not thank him for their clothes, that being forbidden, but they tried every way they could think of to make him see how grateful they were. Which all went for nothing. He didn't notice any change. It turned out to be one of those rich and rare fall days, which is just a June day toned down to a degree where it is heaven to be out of doors. Toward noon the guests arrived, and we assembled under a great tree, and were soon as sociable as old acquaintances. Even the king's reserve melted a little, though it was some little trouble to get him to adjust himself to the name of Jones along at first. I had asked him to try not to forget that he was a farmer, but I had also considered it prudent to ask him to let the thing stand at that, and not elaborate it any, because he was just the kind of person you could depend on to spoil a little thing like that if you didn't warn him. His tongue was so handy, and his spirit so willing, and his information so uncertain. Dowley was in fine feather, and I early got him started, and then adroitly worked him around onto his own history for a text and himself for a hero. And then it was good to sit there and hear him hum. Self-made man, you know. They know how to talk. They deserve more credit than any other breed of men. Yes, that is true, and they are among the very first to find it out, too. He told how he had begun life an orphan lad, without money and without friends able to help him. How he had lived as the slaves of the meanest master lived. How his day's work was from 16 to 18 hours long, and yielded him only enough black bread to keep him in a half-fed condition. How his faithful endeavors finally attracted the attention of a good blacksmith, who came near knocking him dead with kindness by suddenly offering, when he was totally unprepared, to take him as his bound apprentice for 9 years, and give him board and clothes and teach him the trade, or mystery, as Dowley called it. That was his first great rise, his first gorgeous stroke of fortune. And you saw that he couldn't yet speak of it without a sort of eloquent wonder and delight that such a gilded promotion should have fallen to the lot of a common human being. He got no new clothing during his apprenticeship, but on his graduation day his master tricked him out in sprang new toe linens and made him feel unspeakably fine and rich. "I remember me of that day," the wheelwright sang out, with enthusiasm. "And I likewise," cried the mason. "I would not believe they were thine own. In faith I could not." "Nor other," shouted Dowley with sparkling eyes. "I was like to lose my character, the neighbor's wending I had mayhap been stealing. It was a great day, a great day. One forgetteth not days like that." Yes, and his master was a fine man, and prosperous, and always had a great feast of meat twice in the year, and with it white bread, true wheaten bread, in fact, lived like a lord, so to speak. And in time dowily succeeded to the business and married the daughter. And now consider what is come to pass, said he, impressively. 2 times in every month there is fresh meat upon my table. He made a pause here, to let that fact sink home, then added, and 8 times salt meat. It is even true, said the wheelwright, with bated breath. I know it of mine own knowledge, said the mason, in the same reverent fashion. On my table appeareth white bread every Sunday in the year, added the master smith with solemnity. I leave it to your own consciences, friends, if this is not also true. By my head, yes, cried the mason. I can testify to it, and I do, said the wheelwright. And as to furniture, ye shall say yourselves what mine equipment is. He waved his hand in fine gesture of granting frank and unhampered freedom of speech, and added, Speak as ye are moved, speak as ye would speak, and I were not here. Ye have 5 stools, and of the sweetest workmanship at that, albeit your family is but 3, said the wheelwright, with deep respect. And 6 wooden goblets, and 6 platters of wood, and 2 of pewter, to eat and drink from withal, said the mason, impressively. And I say it as knowing God is my judge, and we tarry not here alway, but must answer at the last day for the things said in the body, be they false or be they sooth. Now ye know what manner of man I am, brother Jones, said the smith, with a fine and friendly condescension, and doubtless ye would look to find me a man jealous of his due of respect, and but sparing of outgo to strangers till their rating and quality be assured. But trouble yourself not as concerning that. Wit ye well, ye shall find me a man that regardeth not these matters, but is willing to receive any he, as his fellow, and equal that carrieth a right heart in his body, be his worldly estate howsoever modest. And in token of it, here is my hand, and I say with my own mouth, we are equals. Equals. And he smiled around on the company with the satisfaction of a god who is doing the handsome and gracious thing, and is quite well aware of it. The king took the hand with a poorly disguised reluctance, and let go of it as willingly as a lady lets go of a fish, all of which had a good effect, for it was mistaken for an embarrassment natural to one who has been called upon by greatness. The dame brought out the table now, and set it under the tree. It caused a visible stir of surprise, it being brand new and a sumptuous article of deal. But the surprise rose higher still when the dame, with a body oozing easy indifference at every pore, but eyes that gave it all away by absolutely flaming with vanity, slowly unfolded an actual simon pure tablecloth and spread it. That was a notch above even the blacksmith's domestic grandeurs, and it hit him hard. You could see it. But Marco was in paradise. You could see that, too. Then the dame brought 2 fine new stools. Whew! That was a sensation. It was visible in the eyes of every guest. Then she brought 2 more, as calmly as she could. Sensation again, with awed murmurs. Again she brought 2, walking on air, she was so proud. The guests were petrified, and the mason muttered, There is that about earthly pomps which doth ever move to reverence. As the dame turned away, Marco couldn't help slapping on the climax while the thing was hot. So he said, with what was meant for a languid composure, but was a poor imitation of it, These suffice, leave the rest. So there were more yet! It was a fine effect. I couldn't have played the hand better myself. From this out, the madame piled up the surprises with a rush that fired the general astonishment up to 150 in the shade, and at the same time paralyzed expression of it down to gasped ohs and ahs, and multiple upliftings of hands and eyes. She fetched crockery, new, and plenty of it, new wooden goblets and other table furniture, and beer, fish, chicken, a goose, eggs, roast beef, roast mutton, a ham, a small roast pig, and a wealth of genuine white wheaten bread. Take it by and large, that spread laid everything far and away in the shade that ever that crowd had seen before. And while they sat there just simply stupefied with wonder and awe, I sort of waved my hand as if by accident, and the storekeeper's son emerged from space and said that he had come to collect. "That's all right," I said indifferently. What is the amount? Give us the items." Then he read off this bill, while those three men listened, and serene waves of satisfaction rolled over my soul, and alternate waves of terror and admiration surged over Marco's. 2 pounds salt, 200. 8 dozen pints beer, in the wood, 800. 3 bushels wheat, 2,700. 2 pounds fish, 100. 3 hens, 400. 1 goose, 400. 3 dozen eggs, 150. 1 roast beef, 450. 1 roast of mutton, 400. 1 ham, 800. 1 sucking pig, 500. 2 crockery dinner sets, 6,000. 2 men's suits and underwear, 2,800. 1 stuff and 1 linsey-woolsey gown and underwear, 1,600. 8 wooden goblets, 800. Various table furniture, 10,000. 1 deal table, 3,000. 8 stools, 4,000. 2 miller guns, loaded, 3,000. He ceased. There was a pale and awful silence. Not a limb stirred. Not a nostril betrayed the passage of breath. "Is that all?" I asked, in a voice of the most perfect calmness. "All, fair sir, save that certain matters of light moment are placed together under a head hight sundries. If it would like you, I will separate—" "It is of no consequence," I said, accompanying the words with a gesture of the most utter indifference. "Give me the grand total, please." The clerk leaned against the tree to stay himself, and said, 39,150 milrays. The wheelwright fell off his stool. The others grabbed the table to save themselves, and there was a deep and general ejaculation of, "God be with us in the day of disaster." The clerk hastened to say, "My father chargeth me to say he cannot honorably require you to pay it all at this time, and therefore only prayeth you—" I paid no more heed than if it were the idle breeze, but, with an air of indifference amounting almost to weariness, got out my money, and tossed $4 on to the table. Ha! You should have seen them stare. The clerk was astonished and charmed. He asked me to retain one of those dollars as security, until he could go to town and— I interrupted. "What, and fetch back 9 cents? Nonsense! Take the whole. Keep the change." There was an amazed murmur to this effect. "Verily, this being is made of money. He throweth it away, even as if it were dirt." The blacksmith was a crushed man. The clerk took his money and reeled away drunk with fortune. I said to Marco and his wife, "Good folk, here is a little trifle for you," handing the miller guns as if it were a matter of no consequence, though each of them contained 50 cents in solid cash. And while the poor creatures went to pieces with astonishment and gratitude, I turned to the others and said as calmly as one would ask the time of day, "Well, if we are all ready, I judge the dinner is. Come, fall to." Ah, well, it was immense. Yes, it was a daisy. I don't know that I ever put a situation together better, or got happier spectacular effects out of the materials available. The blacksmith, well, he was simply mashed. Land, I wouldn't have felt what that man was feeling for anything in the world. Here he had been blowing and bragging about his grand meat feast twice a year, and his fresh meat twice a month, and his salt meat twice a week, and his white bread every Sunday the year round, all for a family of 3, the entire cost for the year not above 69 cents, 2 mills and 6 milrays. And all of a sudden here comes along a man who slashes out nearly $4 on a single blowout, and not only that, but acts as if it made him tired to handle such small sums. Yes, Dowley was a good deal whittled, and shrunk up and collapsed. He had the aspect of a bladder balloon that's been stepped on by a cow. End of chapter 32. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, Chapter 33, 6th Century Political Economy. However, I made a dead set at him, and before the first third of the dinner was reached, I had him happy again. It was easy to do, in a country of ranks and castes. You see, in a country where they have ranks and castes, a man isn't ever a man. He's only part of a man. He can't ever get his full growth. You prove your superiority over him in station, or rank, or fortune, and that's the end of it. He knuckles down. You can't insult him after that. No, I don't mean quite that. Of course you can insult him. I only mean it's difficult, and so, unless you've got a lot of useless time on your hands, it doesn't pay to try. I had the smith's reverence now, because I was apparently immensely prosperous and rich. I could have had his adoration if I had had some little gimcrack title of nobility. And not only his, but any commoner's in the land, though he were the mightiest production of all the ages, in intellect, worth, and character, and I bankrupt in all three. This was to remain so as long as England should exist in the earth. With the spirit of prophecy upon me, I could look into the future and see her erect statues and monuments to her unspeakable Georges and other royal and noble clothes horses, and leave unhonored the creators of this world, after God, Gutenberg, Watt, Arkwright, Whitney, Morris, Stevenson, Bell. The king got his cargo aboard, and then the talk not turning upon battle, conquest, or ironclad duel, he dulled down to drowsiness and went off to take a nap. Mrs. Marco cleared the table, placed the beer keg handy, and went away to eat her dinner of leavings in humble privacy. And the rest of us soon drifted into matters near and dear to the hearts of our sort. Business and wages, of course. At first glance, things appeared to be exceedingly prosperous in this little tributary kingdom, whose lord was King Bagdemagus, as compared with the state of things in my own region. They had the protection system in full force here, whereas we were working along down toward free trade, by easy stages, and were now about halfway. Before long, Dowley and I were doing all the talking, the others hungrily listening. Dowley warmed to his work, snuffed an advantage in the air, and began to put questions which he considered pretty awkward ones for me. And they did have something of that look. In your country, brother, what is the wage of a master bailiff, master hind, carter, shepherd, swineherd? 25 milrays a day, that is to say, a quarter of a cent. The smith's face beamed with joy. He said, With us they are allowed the double of it. And what may a mechanic get? Carpenter, dauber, mason, painter, blacksmith, wheelwright, and the like. On the average, 50 milrays, half a cent a day. Ho, ho! With us they are allowed 100. With us any good mechanic is allowed a cent a day. I count out the tailor, but not the others. They are all allowed a cent a day, and in driving times they get more. Yes, up to 110 and even 15 milrays a day. I've paid 115 myself within the week. Raw for protection! To Sheol with fair trade. And his face shone upon the company like a sunburst. But I didn't scare at all. I rigged up my pile driver and allowed myself 15 minutes to drive him into the earth. Drive him all in. Drive him in till not even the curve of his skull should show above the ground. Here's the way I started in on him. I asked, What do you pay a pound for salt? 100 milrays. We pay 40. What do you pay for beef and mutton? When you buy it. That was a neat hit. It made the color come. It varieth somewhat, but not much. One may say 75 milrays the pound. We pay 33. What do you pay for eggs? 50 milrays the dozen. We pay 20. What do you pay for beer? It costeth us 8½ milrays the pint. We get it for 4, 25 bottles for a cent. What do you pay for wheat? At the rate of 900 milrays the bushel. We pay 400. What do you pay for a man's tow linen suit? 13 cents. We pay 6. What do you pay for a stuff gown for the wife of the laborer or the mechanic? We pay 8 cents 4 mills. Well, observe the difference. You pay 8 cents and 4 mills. We pay only 4 cents. I prepared now to sock it to him. I said, "Look here, dear friend. What's become of your high wages you were bragging so about a few minutes ago?" And I looked around on the company with a placid satisfaction, for I had slipped up on him gradually and tied him hand and foot, you see, without his ever noticing that he was being tied at all. "What's become of those noble high wages of yours? I seem to have knocked the stuffing all out of them, it appears to me." But if you will believe me, he merely looked surprised. That is all. He didn't grasp the situation at all, didn't know he had walked into a trap, didn't discover that he was in a trap. I could have shot him from sheer vexation. With cloudy eye and struggling intellect, he fetched this out. "Mary, I seem not to understand. It is proved that our wages be double thine. How then may it be that thou hast knocked therefrom the stuffing, and miscall not the wonderly word? This being the first time under grace and providence of God it hath been granted me to hear it." Well, I was stunned. Partly with his unlooked-for stupidity on his part, and partly because his fellows so manifestly sided with him, and were of his mind, if you might call it mind. My position was simple enough, plain enough. How could it ever be simplified more? However, I must try. "Why, look here, Brother Dowley. Don't you see? Your wages are merely higher than ours in name, not in fact." "Hear him! They are double. Ye have confessed it yourself." Yes, I don't deny that at all, but that's got nothing to do with it. The amount of the wages in mere coins, with meaningless names attached to them to know them by, has got nothing to do with it. The thing is, how much can you buy with your wages? That's the idea. Well, it is true that with you a good mechanic is allowed about $3.50 a year, and with us only about $1.75. There! You're confessing it again! You're confessing it again! Confound it! I never denied it, I tell you. What I say is this. With us, half a dollar buys more than $1 buys with you, and therefore it stands to reason, and the commonest kind of common sense, that our wages are higher than yours. He looked dazed, and said despairingly, "Verily, I cannot make it out. Ye've just said ours are the higher, and with the same breath ye take it back. Oh, great Scott! Isn't it possible to get such a simple thing through your head? Now look here, let me illustrate. We pay 4 cents for a woman's stuff gown. You pay 8 cents 4 mills, which is 4 mills more than double. What do you allow a laboring woman who works on a farm? 2 mills a day. Very good. We allow but half as much. We pay her only 1/10 of a cent a day, and again you're Wait. Now, you see, the thing is very simple. This time you'll understand it. For instance, it takes your woman 42 days to earn her gown, at 2 mills a day, 7 weeks' work. But ours earns hers in 40 days, 2 days short of 7 weeks. Your woman has a gown, and her whole 7 weeks' wages are gone. Ours has a gown, and 2 days' wages left to buy something else with. There. Now you understand it. He merely looked dubious. It's the most I can say. So did the others. I waited to let the thing work. Dowley spoke at last, and betrayed the fact that he actually hadn't gotten away from his rooted and grounded superstitions yet. He said, with a trifle of hesitancy, But ye cannot fail to grant that 2 mills a day is better than 1. Shucks. Well, of course. I hated to give it up, so I chanced another flyer. Let us suppose a case. Suppose one of your journeymen goes out and buys the following articles: 1 pound of salt, 1 dozen eggs, 1 dozen pints of beer, 1 bushel of wheat, 1 tow linen suit, 5 pounds of beef, 5 pounds of mutton. The lot will cost him 32 cents. It takes him 32 working days to earn the money, 5 weeks and 2 days. Let him come to us and work 32 days at half the wages. He can buy all those things for a shade under 14.5 cents. They will cost him a shade under 29 days' work, and he will have about half a week's wages left over. Carry it through the year, he would save nearly a week's wages every 2 months. Your man, nothing. Thus saving 5 or 6 weeks' wages in a year. Your man, not a cent. Now I reckon you understand that high wages and low wages are phrases that don't mean anything in the world until you find out which of them will buy the most. It was a crusher. But alas, it didn't crush. No, I had to give it up. What those people valued was high wages. It didn't seem to be a matter of any consequence to them whether the high wages would buy anything or not. They stood for protection and swore by it, which was reasonable enough because interested parties had gulled them into the notion that it was protection which had created their high wages. I proved to them that in a quarter of a century their wages had advanced but 30%, while the cost of living had gone up 100%, and that with us, in a shorter time, wages had advanced 40%, while the cost of living had gone down steadily. But it didn't do any good. Nothing could unseat their strange beliefs. Well, I was smarting under a sense of defeat. Undeserved defeat. But what of that? That didn't soften the smart any. And to think of the circumstances. The first statesman of the age, the capablest man, the best informed man in the entire world, the loftiest, uncrowned head that had ever moved the clouds of any political firmament for centuries, sitting here, apparently defeated in argument by an ignorant country blacksmith. And I could see that those others were sorry for me, which made me blush till I could smell my whiskers scorching. Put yourself in my place. Feel as mean as I did, as ashamed as I felt. Wouldn't you have struck below the belt to get even? Yes, you would. It is simply human nature. Now, that is what I did. I'm not trying to justify it. I'm only saying that I was mad, and anybody would have done it. Well, when I make up my mind to hit a man, I don't plan out a love tap. No, that isn't my way. As long as I'm going to hit him at all, I'm going to hit him a lifter. And I don't jump him all of a sudden and risk making a blundering halfway business of it. No, I get away off yonder to one side and work up on him gradually, so that he never suspects that I'm going to hit him at all. And by, all in a flash, he's flat on his back, and he can't tell for the life of him how it all happened. That's the way I went for Brother Dowley. I started to talking lazy and comfortable, as if I was just talking to pass the time. And the oldest man in the world couldn't have taken the bearings of my starting place and guessed where I was going to fetch up. Boys, there's a good many curious things about law and custom and usage and all that sort of thing, when you come to look at it. Yes, and about the drift and progress of human opinion and movement, too. There are written laws. They perish. But there are also unwritten laws. They are eternal. Take the unwritten law of wages. It says they've got to advance, little by little, and straight through the centuries. And notice how it works. We know what wages are now, here and there and yonder. We strike an average, and say that's the wages of today. We know what the wages were 100 years ago, and what they were 200 years ago. That's as far back as we can get, but it suffices to give us the law of progress, the measure and rate of the periodical augmentation. And so, without a document to help us, we can come pretty close to determining what the wages were 300 and 400 and 500 years ago. Good so far. Do we stop here? No. We stop looking backward. We face around and apply the law to the future. My friends, I can tell you what people's wages are going to be at any date in the future you want to know, for hundreds and hundreds of years. What, good man, what? Yes, in 700 years, wages will have risen to 6 times what they are now, here in your region. and farmhands will be allowed 3 cents a day, and mechanics 6. I wouldn't I might die now and live then, interrupted Smug, the wheelwright, with a fine avarice glow in his eye. And that isn't all. They'll get their board besides, such as it is. It won't bloat them. 250 years later, pay attention now, a mechanic's wages will be, mind you, this is law, not guesswork, a mechanic's wages will then be 20 cents a day. There was a general gasp of awed astonishment. Dixon the mason murmured with raised eyes and hands, "More than 3 weeks' pay for 1 day's work!" "Riches, of a truth, yes, riches," muttered Marco, his breath coming quick and short with excitement. "Wages will keep on rising, little by little, as steadily as a tree grows, and at the end of 340 years more, there will be at least one country where the mechanic's average wage will be 200 cents a day." It knocked them absolutely dumb. Not a man of them could get his breath for upwards of 2 minutes. The coal-burner said prayerfully, "Might I but live to see it." "It is the income of an earl," said Smug. "An earl, say ye?" said Dowley. "Ye could say more than that, and speak no lie. There's no earl in the realm of Bagdemagus that hath an income like to that. Income of an earl? Humph! It's the income of an angel." Now then, that is what is going to happen as regards wages. In the remote day, that man will earn with 1 week's work that bill of goods which it takes you upwards of 50 weeks to earn now. And some other pretty surprising things are going to happen, too. Brother Dowley, who is it that determines, every spring, what the particular wage of each kind of mechanic, laborer, and servant shall be for that year? Sometimes the courts, sometimes the town council, but most of all the magistrate. Ye may say, in general terms, it is the magistrate that fixes the wages. Doesn't ask any of those poor devils to help him fix their wages for them, does he? That were an idea. The master's that's to pay him the money is the one that's rightly concerned in that matter, ye will notice. Yes, but I thought the other man might have some little trifle at stake in it too, and even his wife and children, poor creatures. The masters are these: nobles, rich men, the prosperous generally. These few who do not work determine what pay the vast hive shall have who do work. You see, they're a combine, a trade union, to coin a new phrase, who band themselves together to force their lowly brother to take what they choose to give. 1,300 years hence, so says the unwritten law, the combine will be the other way. And then, how these fine people's prosperity will fume and fret and grit their teeth over the insolent tyranny of trade unions. Yes, indeed, the magistrate will tranquilly arrange the wages from now clear away down into the 19th century. And then, all of a sudden, the wage earner will consider that a couple of 1,000 years or so is enough of this one-sided sort of thing, and he will raise up and take a hand in fixing his own wages himself. He'll have a long and bitter account of wrong and humiliation to settle. Do ye believe that he actually will help to fix his own wages? Yes, indeed. And he will be strong and able then. Brave times of a truth, sneered the prosperous smith. Oh, and there's another detail. In that day, a master may hire a man for only just 1 day, or 1 week, or 1 month at a time if he wants to. What? It is true. Moreover, a magistrate won't be able to force a man to work for a master a whole year on a stretch, whether the man wants to or not. Will there be no law or sense in that day? Both of them, Dowley. In that day a man will be his own property, not the property of a magistrate and master, and he can leave town whenever he wants to if the wages don't suit him, and they can't put him in the pillory for it. Perdition catch such an age, shouted Dowley, in strong indignation. An age of dogs, an age barren of reverence for superiors and respect for authority. The pillory. Oh, wait, brother, say no good word for that institution. I think the pillory ought to be abolished. "A most strange idea. Why?" "Well, I tell you why. Is a man ever put in the pillory for a capital crime?" "No." "Is it right to condemn a man to a slight punishment for a small offense, and then kill him?" There was no answer. I had scored my first point. For the first time the smith wasn't up and ready. The company noticed it. It was a good effect. "You don't answer, brother. You were about to glorify the pillory a while ago, and shed some pity on a future age that isn't going to use it. I think the pillory ought to be abolished. What usually happens when a poor fellow is put in the pillory for some little offense that didn't amount to anything in the world? The mob try to have some fun with him, don't they?" "Yes. They begin by clodding him, and they laugh themselves to pieces to see him try to dodge one clod and get hit with another." "Yes." "Then they throw dead cats at him, don't they?" "Yes." "Well, then, suppose he has a few personal enemies in that mob, and here and there a man or a woman with a secret grudge against him? And suppose, especially, that he is unpopular in the community, for his pride or his prosperity or one thing or another? Stones and bricks take the place of clods and cats presently, don't they?" "There is no doubt about it." "As a rule he is crippled for life, isn't he? Jaws broken, teeth smashed out, or legs mutilated, gangrened, presently cut off? Or an eye knocked out, maybe both eyes?" "It is true. God knoweth it." "And if he is unpopular, he can depend on dying right there in the stocks, can't he?" "He surely can. One may not deny it." "I take it none of you are unpopular, by reason of pride, or insolence, or conspicuous prosperity, or any of those things that excite envy and malice among the base scum of a village? You wouldn't think it much of a risk to take a chance in the stocks?" Dowley winced, visibly. I judged he was hit. But he didn't betray it by any spoken word. As for the others, they spoke out plainly and with strong feeling. They said they had seen enough of the stocks to know what a man's chance in them was, and they would never consent to enter them if they could compromise on a quick death by hanging. Well, to change the subject, for I think I've established my point that the stocks ought to be abolished. I think some of our laws are pretty unfair. For instance, if I do a thing which ought to deliver me to the stocks, and you knew I did it, and yet keep still and don't report me, you will get the stocks if anybody informs on you." "Ah, but that would serve you but right," said Dowley, "for you must inform. So saith the law." The others coincided. "Well, all right, let it go, since you vote me down. But there's one thing which certainly isn't fair. The magistrate fixes a mechanic's wage at 1 cent a day, for instance. The law says that if any master shall venture, even under the utmost press of business, to pay anything over that cent a day, even for a single day, he shall be both fined and pilloried for it, and whoever knows he did it and doesn't inform, they also shall be fined and pilloried. Now it seems unfair, Dowley, and a deadly peril to all of us, that because you thoughtlessly confessed a while ago that within a week you have paid 1 cent and 15 mil. Oh, I could tell you it was a smasher. You ought to have seen them go to pieces, the whole gang. I had just slipped up on poor, smiling, and complacent Dowley so nice and easily and softly that he never expected anything was going to happen till the blow came crashing down and knocked him all to rags. A fine effect. In fact, as fine as any I ever produced with so little time to work it up in. But I saw in a moment that I had overdone the thing a little. I was expecting to scare them, but I wasn't expecting to scare them to death. They were mighty near it, though. You could see they had been a whole lifetime learning to appreciate the pillory, and to have that thing staring them in the face, and every one of them distinctly at the mercy of me, a stranger, if I chose to go and report. Well, it was awful, and they couldn't seem to recover from the shock. They couldn't seem to pull themselves together. Pale, shaky, dumb, pitiful. Why, they weren't any better than so many dead men. It was very uncomfortable. Of course, I thought they would appeal to me to keep mum, and then we would shake hands and take a drink all around and laugh it off, and there an end. But no. You see, I was an unknown person among a cruelly oppressed and suspicious people. A people always accustomed to having advantage taken of their helplessness, and never expecting just or kind treatment from any but their own families and very closest intimates. Appeal to me to be gentle? To be fair? To be generous? Of course they wanted to, but they couldn't dare. End of chapter 33. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 34. The Yankee and the King Sold as Slaves. Well, what had I better do? Nothing in a hurry, sure. I must get up a diversion. Anything to employ me while I could think, and while these poor fellows could have a chance to come to life again. There sat Marco, petrified in the act of trying to get the hang of his miller gun, turned to stone, just in the attitude he was in when my pile-driver fell, the toy still gripped in his unconscious fingers. So I took it from him and proposed to explain its mystery. Mystery! A simple thing like that, and yet it was mysterious enough, for that race and that age. I never saw such an awkward people with machinery. You see, they were totally unused to it. The miller gun was a little double-barreled tube of toughened glass, with a neat little trick of a spring to it, which upon pressure would let a shot escape. But the shot wouldn't hurt anybody. It would only drop into your hand. In the gun were two sizes, wee mustard seed shot, and another sort that were several times larger. They were money. The mustard seed shot represented mill rays, the larger ones mills. So the gun was a purse, and very handy, too. You could pay out money in the dark with it, with accuracy, and you could carry it in your mouth or in your vest pocket if you had one. I made them of several sizes, one size so large that it would carry the equivalent of $1. Using shot for money was a good thing for the government. The metal cost nothing, and the money couldn't be counterfeited, for I was the only person in the kingdom who knew how to manage a shot tower. Paying the shot soon came to be a common phrase. Yes, and I knew it would still be passing men's lips away down in the 19th century, yet none would suspect how and when it originated. The king joined us, about this time, mightily refreshed by his nap and feeling good. Anything could make me feel nervous now. I was so uneasy, for our lives were in danger, and so it worried me to detect a complacent something in the king's eye which seemed to indicate that he had been loading himself up for a performance of some kind or other. Confound it! Why must he go and choose a time such as this? I was right. He began straight off in the most innocently artful and transparent and lubberly way, to lead up to the subject of agriculture. The cold sweat broke out all over me. I wanted to whisper in his ear, "Man, we are in awful danger. Every moment is worth a principality till we get back these men's confidence. Don't waste any of this golden time." But of course I couldn't do it. Whisper to him? It would look as if we were conspiring. So I had to sit there and look calm and pleasant while the king stood over that dynamite mine and mooned along about his damned onions and things. At first the tumult of my own thoughts, summoned by the danger signal and swarming to the rescue from every quarter of my skull, kept up such a hurrah and confusion and fifing and drumming that I couldn't take in a word. But presently, when my mob of gathering plans began to crystallize and fall into position and form a line of battle, a sort of order and quiet ensued, and I caught the bottom of the king's batteries, as if out of remote distance. "We're not the best way, methinks, albeit it is not to be denied that authorities differ as concerning this point, some contending that the onion is but an unwholesome berry when stricken early from the tree, The audience showed signs of life, and sought each other's eyes in a surprised and troubled way. While as others do yet maintain, with much show of reason, that this is not of necessity the case, instancing that plums and other like cereals do be always dug in the unripe state. The audience exhibited distinct distress, yes, and also fear. Yet are they clearly wholesome, the more especially when one doth assuage the asperities of their nature by a mixture of the tranquilizing juice of the wayward cabbage? The wild light of terror began to glow in these men's eyes, and one of them muttered, "These be errors, every one. God hath surely smitten the mind of this farmer." I was in miserable apprehension. I sat upon thorns. And further instancing the known truth that in the case of animals, the young, which may be called the green fruit of the creature, is the better, all confessing that when a goat is ripe, his fur doth heat and sore and game his flesh, the which defect taken in connection with his several rancid habits, and fulsome appetites, and godless attitudes of mind, and villainous quality of morals. They rose and went for him, with a fierce shout. "The one would betray us, the other is mad! Kill them! Kill them!" They flung themselves upon us. What joy flamed up in the king's eye! He might be lame in agriculture, but this kind of thing was just his line. He had been fasting long. He was hungry for a fight. He hit the blacksmith a crack under the jaw that lifted him clear off his feet and stretched him flat on his back. "St. George for Britain!" and he downed the wheelwright. The mason was big, but I laid him out like nothing. The three gathered themselves up and came again, and went down again, came again, and kept on repeating this with native British pluck until they were battered to jelly, reeling with exhaustion, and so blind that they couldn't tell us from each other, and yet they kept right on, hammering away with what might was left in them. Hammering each other, for we stepped aside and looked on while they rolled and struggled and gouged and pounded and bit, with the strict and wordless attention to business of so many bulldogs. We looked on without apprehension, for they were fast getting past ability to go for help against us, and the arena was far enough from the public road to be safe from intrusion. Well, they were gradually playing out. It suddenly occurred to me to wonder what had become of Marco. I looked around. He was nowhere to be seen. Oh, but this was ominous. I pulled the king's sleeve, and we glided away and rushed for the hut. No Marco there, no Phyllis there. I had gone to the road for help, sure. I told the king to give his heels wings, and I would explain later. We made good time across the open ground, and as we darted into the shelter of the wood, I glanced back and saw a mob of excited peasants swarm into view, with Marco and his wife at their head. They were making a world of noise, but that couldn't hurt anybody. The wood was dense, and as soon as we were well into its depths, we would take to a tree and let them whistle. But then came another sound. Dogs. Yes, that was quite another matter. It magnified our contract. We must find running water. We tore along at a good gait, and soon left the sounds far behind and modified to a murmur. We struck a stream and darted into it. We waded swiftly down it in the dim forest light, for as much as 300 yards, and then came across an oak with a great bough sticking out over the water. We climbed up on this bough, and began to work our way along it to the body of the tree. Now we began to hear those sounds more plainly, so the mob had struck our trail. For a while the sounds approached pretty fast, and then for a while they didn't. No doubt the dogs had found the place where we had entered the stream, and were now waltzing up and down the shores trying to pick up the trail again. When we were snugly lodged in the tree and curtained with foliage, the king was satisfied, but I was doubtful. I believed we could crawl along a branch and get into the next tree, and I judged it worth while to try. We tried it, and made a success of it, though the king slipped at the junction and came near failing to connect. We got comfortable lodgment and satisfactory concealment among the foliage, and then we had nothing to do but listen to the hunt. Presently we heard it coming, and coming on the jump, too. Yes, and down both sides of the stream. Louder, Louder next minute, it swelled swiftly up into a roar of shoutings, barkings, tramplings, and swept by like a cyclone. I was afraid that the overhanging branch would suggest something to them, said I, but I don't mind the disappointment. Come, my liege, it were well that we make good use of the time. We flank them. Dark is coming on presently. If we can cross the stream and get a good start, and borrow a couple of horses from somebody's pasture to use for a few hours, we shall be safe enough. We started down and got nearly to the lowest limb, when we seemed to hear the hunt returning. We stopped to listen. Yes, said I, they're baffled. They've given it up. They're on their way home. We'll climb back to our roost again and let them go by. So we climbed back. The king listened a moment and said, They still search. I wit the sign. We did best to abide. He was right. He knew more about hunting than I did. The noise approached steadily, but not with a rush. The king said, They reason that we were advantaged by no perilous start of them, and being on foot are as yet no mighty way from where we took the water. Yes, sire, that is about it, I am afraid, though I was hoping better things. The noise drew nearer and nearer, and soon the van was drifting under us, on both sides of the water. A voice called a halt from the other bank, and said, An they were so minded, they could get to yon tree by this branch that overhangs, and yet not touch ground. Ye will do well to send a man up it. Marry, that we will do. I was obliged to admire my cuteness in foreseeing this very thing, and swapping trees to beat it. But don't you know there are some things that can beat smartness and foresight? Awkwardness and stupidity can. The best swordsman in the world doesn't need to fear the second best swordsman in the world. No, the person for him to be afraid of is some ignorant antagonist who has never had a sword in his hand before. He doesn't do the thing he ought to do, and so the expert isn't prepared for him. He does the thing he ought not to do, and often it catches the expert out and ends him on the spot. Well, how could I, with all my gifts, make any valuable preparation against a near-sighted, cross-eyed, pudding-headed clown who would aim himself at the wrong tree and hit the right one? And that is what he did. He went for the wrong tree, which was, of course, the right one by mistake, and up he started. Matters were serious now. We remained still and awaited developments. The peasant toiled his difficult way up. The king raised himself up and stood. He made a leg ready, and when the comer's head arrived in reach of it, there was a dull thud, and down went the man floundering to the ground. There was a wild outbreak of anger below. The mob swarmed in from all around, and there we were, treed and prisoners. Another man started up. The bridging bough was detected, and a volunteer started up the tree that furnished the bridge. The king ordered me to play Horatius and keep the bridge. For a while the enemy came thick and fast, but no matter. The head man of each procession always got a buffet that dislodged him as soon as he came in reach. The king's spirits rose. His joy was limitless. He said that if nothing occurred to mar the prospect, we should have a beautiful night, for on this line of tactics we could hold the tree against the whole countryside. However, the mob soon came to that conclusion themselves, wherefore they called off the assault and began to debate other plans. They had no weapons, but there were plenty of stones, and stones might answer. We had no objections. A stone might possibly penetrate to us once in a while, but it wasn't very likely. We were well protected by boughs and foliage, and were not visible from any good aiming point. If they would but waste half an hour in stone throwing, the dark would come to our help. We were feeling very well satisfied. We could smile, almost laugh. But we didn't, which was just as well, for we should have been interrupted. Before the stones had been raging through the leaves and bouncing from boughs 15 minutes, we began to notice a smell. A couple sniffs of it was enough of an explanation. It was smoke. Our game was up at last. We recognized that. When smoke invites you, you have to come. They raised their pile of dry brush and damp weeds higher and higher, and when they saw the thick cloud begin to roll up and smother the tree, they broke out in a storm of joy clamors. I got enough breath to say, Proceed, my liege. After you is manners. The king gasped, Follow me down, and then back thyself against one side of the trunk, and leave me the other. Then will we fight. Let each pile his dead according to his own fashion and taste. Then he descended, barking and coughing, and I followed. I struck the ground an instant after him. We sprang to our appointed places, and began to give and take with all our might. The powwow and racket were prodigious. It was a tempest of riot and confusion and thick-falling blows. Suddenly some horsemen tore into the midst of the crowd, and a voice shouted, Hold, or ye are dead men. How good it sounded! The owner of the voice bore all the marks of a gentleman, picturesque and costly raiment, the aspect of command, a hard countenance, with complexion and features marred by dissipation. The mob fell humbly back, like so many spaniels. The gentleman inspected us critically, and then said sharply to the peasants, What are ye doing to these people? They be madmen, worshipful sir, that have come wandering, we know not whence, and ye know not whence? Do ye pretend ye know them not? Most honored sir, we speak but the truth. They are strangers and unknown to any in this region, and they be the most violent and bloodthirsty madmen that ever— Peace! Ye know not what ye say. They are not mad. Who are ye, and whence are ye? Explain. We are but peaceful strangers, sir, I said, and traveling upon our own concerns. We are from a far country, and unacquainted here. We have purposed no harm, and yet but for your brave interference and protection these people would have killed us. As you have divined, sir, we are not mad, neither are we violent or bloodthirsty. The gentleman turned to his retinue and said calmly, Lash me these animals to their kennels. The mob vanished in an instant, and after them plunged the horsemen, laying about them with their whips and piteously riding down such as were witless enough to keep the road instead of taking to the bush. The shrieks and supplications presently died away in the distance, and soon the horsemen began to straggle back. Meantime, the gentleman had been questioning us more closely, but had dug no particulars out of us. We were lavish of recognition of the service he was doing us, but we revealed nothing more than that we were friendless strangers from a far country. When the escort were all returned, the gentleman said to one of his servants, Bring the lead horses, and mount these people. Yes, my lord. We were placed toward the rear, among the servants. We traveled pretty fast, and finally drew rein some time after dark at a roadside inn, some 10 or 12 miles from the scene of our troubles. My lord went immediately to his room after ordering his supper, and we saw no more of him. At dawn in the morning we breakfasted and made ready to start. My lord's chief attendant sauntered forward at that moment with indolent grace, and said, Ye have said ye should continue upon this road, which is our direction likewise. Wherefore my lord, the Earl Grip, hath given commandment that ye retain the horses and ride, and that certain of us ride with ye a 20 mile to a fair town that hight Cabinet, whenso ye shall be out of peril. We could do nothing less than express our thanks and accept the offer. We jogged along, 6 in a party at a moderate and comfortable gait, and in conversation learned that my Lord Grip was a very great personage in his own region, which lay a day's journey beyond Cabernet. We loitered to such a degree that it was near middle of the forenoon when we entered the market square of the town. We dismounted, and left our thanks once more for my lord, and then approached a crowd assembled in the center of the square, to see what might be the object of interest. It was the remnant of that old peregrinating band of slaves. So they had been dragging their chains about all this time. And that poor husband was gone, and also many others, and some few purchases had been added to the gang. The king was not interested, and wanted to move along, but I was absorbed, and full of pity. I could not take my eyes away from those worn and wasted wrecks of humanity. There they sat, grounded upon the ground, silent, uncomplaining, with bowed heads, a pathetic sight. And by hideous contrast, a redundant orator was making a speech to another gathering not 30 steps away, in fulsome laudation of our glorious British liberties. I was boiling. I had forgotten I was a plebeian, and was remembering I was a man. Cost what it might, I would mount that rostrum, and click! The king and I were handcuffed together. Our companions, those servants, had done it. My Lord Grip stood looking on. The king burst out in a fury, and said, "What meaneth this ill-mannered jest?" My lord merely said to his head miscreant coolly, "Put up the slaves, and sell them." Slaves? The word had a new sound, and how unspeakably awful! The king lifted his manacles and brought them down with a deadly force, but my lord was out of the way when they arrived. A dozen of the rascals' servants sprang forward, and in a moment we were helpless, with our hands bound behind us. We so loudly and earnestly proclaimed ourselves free men that we got the interested attention of that liberty-mouthing orator and his patriotic crowd, and they gathered about us and assumed a very determined attitude. The orator said, "If indeed ye are free men, ye have naught to fear. The God-given liberties of Britain are about ye for your shield and shelter." There was applause. "Ye shall soon see. Bring forth your proofs." "What proofs?" "Proof that ye are free men." Ah, I remembered. I came to myself. I said nothing. But the king stormed out, "Thou art insane, man! It were better, and more in reason, that this thief and scoundrel here prove that we are not free men." You see, he knew his own laws just as other people so often know the laws, by words, not by effects. They take a meaning, and get to be very vivid when you come to apply them to yourself. All hands shook their heads and looked disappointed. Some turned away, no longer interested. The orator said, and this time in the tones of business, not of sentiment, "An ye do not know your country's laws, it were time ye learned them. Ye are strangers to us, ye will not deny that. Ye may be free men, we do not deny that. But also ye may be slaves. The law is clear. It doth not require the claimant to prove ye are slaves, it requireth you to prove ye are not." I said, "Dear sir, give us only time to send to Astolat, or give us only time to send to the Valley of Holiness." "Peace, good man, these are extraordinary requests, and you may not hope to have them granted. It would cost much time, and would unwarrantably inconvenience your master." "Master, idiot!" stormed the king. "I have no master. I myself am the Silence, for God's sake!" I got the words out in time to stop the king. We were in trouble enough already. It could not help us any to give these people the notion that we were lunatics. There is no use in stringing out the details. The earl put us up and sold us at auction. This same infernal law had existed in our own South in my own time, more than 1,300 years later, and under it hundreds of free men who could not prove that they were free men had been sold into lifelong slavery without the circumstance making any particular impression upon me. But the minute law and the auction block came into my personal experience, a thing which had been merely improper before became suddenly hellish. Well, that's the way we're made. Yes, we were sold at auction, like swine. In a big town and an active market, we should have brought a good price, but this place was utterly stagnant, and so we sold at a figure which makes me ashamed every time I think of it. The King of England brought $7, and his Prime Minister 9, whereas the king was easily worth $12, and I as easily worth 15. But that is the way things always go. If you force a sale on a dull market, I don't care what the property is, you are going to make a poor business of it. And you can make up your mind to it. If the earl had had wit enough to... However, there is no occasion for my working my sympathies up on his account. Let him go for the present. I took his number, so to speak. The slave dealer bought us both, and hitched us on to that long chain of his, and we constituted the rear of his procession. We took up our line of march and passed out of Cambernay at noon, and it seemed to me unaccountably strange and odd that the King of England and his chief minister, marching manacled and fettered and yoked in a slave convoy, could move by all manner of idle men and women, and under windows where sat the sweet and the lovely, and yet never attract a curious eye, never provoke a single remark. Dear, dear, it only shows that there is nothing diviner about a king than there is about a tramp after all. He is just a cheap and hollow artificiality, when you don't know he is a king. But reveal his quality, and dear me, it takes your very breath away to look at him. I reckon we are all fools. Born so, no doubt. End of chapter 34. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. This is chapter 35, A Pitiful Incident. It's a world of surprises. The king brooded. This was natural. What would he brood about, should you say? Why, about the prodigious nature of his fall, of course, from the loftiest place in the world to the lowest, from the most illustrious station in the world to the obscurest, from the grandest vocation among men to the basest. No, I take my oath that the thing that gravelled him most, to start with, was not this, but the price he had fetched. He couldn't seem to get over that $7. Well, it stunned me so when I first found it out, that I couldn't believe it. It didn't seem natural. But as soon as my mental sight cleared and I got a right focus on it, I saw I was mistaken. It was natural. For this reason, a king is a mere artificiality, and so a king's feelings, like the impulses of an automatic doll, are mere artificialities. But as a man, he is a reality, and his feelings as a man are real, not phantoms. It shames the average man to be valued below his own estimate of his worth, and the king certainly wasn't anything more than an average man, if he was up that high. Confound him! He wearied me with arguments to show that in anything like a fair market he would have fetched $25 sure, a thing which was plainly nonsense, and full of the baldest conceit. I wasn't worth it myself, but it was tender ground for me to argue on. In fact, I had to simply shirk the argument and do the diplomatic instead. I had to throw conscience aside and brazenly concede that he ought to have brought $25, whereas I was quite well aware that in all the ages the world had never seen a king that was worth half the money, and during the next 13 centuries wouldn't see one that was worth the fourth of it. Yes, he tired me. If he began to talk about the crops, or about the recent weather, or about the condition of politics, or about dogs, or cats, or morals, or theology, no matter what, I sighed, for I knew what was coming. He was going to get out of it a palliation of that tiresome $7 sale. Wherever we halted where there was a crowd, he would give me a look which said plainly, if that thing could be tried over again now, with this kind of folk, you would see a different result. Well, when he was first sold, it secretly tickled me to see him go for $7. But before he was done with his sweating and worrying, I wished he had fetched 100. The thing never got a chance to die, for every day at one place or another, possible purchasers looked us over, and, as often as any other way, their comment on the king was something like this: here's a $2.50 chump with a $30 style. Pity, but style was marketable. At last this sort of remark produced an evil result. Our owner was a practical person, and he perceived that this defeat must be mended if he hoped to find a purchaser for the king. So he went to work to take the style out of his sacred majesty. I could have given the man some valuable advice, but I didn't. You mustn't volunteer advice to a slave driver, unless you want to damage the cause you're arguing for. I had found it a sufficiently difficult job to reduce the king's style to a peasant's style, even when he was a willing and anxious pupil. Now then, to undertake to reduce the king's style to a slave's style, and by force, go to. It was a stately contract. Never mind the details. It will save me trouble to let you imagine them. I will only remark that at the end of a week there was plenty of evidence that lash and club and fist had done their work well. The king's body was a sight to see, and to weep over. But his spirit? Why, it wasn't even phased. Even that dull clod of a slave-driver was able to see that there can be such a thing as a slave who will remain a man till he dies, whose bones you can break, but whose manhood you can't. This man found that from his first effort down to his latest, he couldn't ever come within reach of the king, but the king was ready to plunge for him, and did it. So he gave up at last, and left the king in possession of his style unimpaired. The fact is, the king was a good deal more than a king. He was a man, and when a man is a man, you can't knock it out of him. We had a rough time for a month, tramping to and fro in the earth and suffering. And what Englishman was the most interested in the slavery question by that time? His Grace the King. Yes, from being the most indifferent, he was become the most interested. He was become the bitterest hater of that institution I had ever heard talk. And so I ventured to once more a question which I had asked years before, and had gotten such a sharp answer that I had not thought it prudent to meddle in the matter further. Would he abolish slavery? His answer was as sharp as before, but it was music this time. I shouldn't ever wish to hear pleasanter, though the profanity was not good, being awkwardly put together, and with the crash word almost in the middle instead of at the end, where of course it ought to have been. I was ready and willing to get free now. I hadn't wanted to get free any sooner. No, I cannot quite say that. I had wanted to, but I had not been willing to take desperate chances, and had always dissuaded the king from them. But now, it was a new atmosphere. Liberty would be worth any cost that might be put upon it now. I set out a plan, and was straightway charmed with it. It would require time, yes, and patience too, a great deal of both. One could invent quicker ways, and fully as sure ones, but none that would be as picturesque as this, none that could be made so dramatic. And so I was not going to give this one up. It might delay us months, but no matter. I would carry it out or break something. Now and then we had an adventure. One night we were overtaken by a snowstorm, while still a mile from the village we were making for. Almost instantly we were shut up as in a fog. The driving snow was so thick. You couldn't see a thing, and we were soon lost. The slave-driver lashed us desperately, for he saw ruin before him. But his lashings only made matters worse, for they drove us further from the road and from likelihood of succor. So we had to stop at last, and slump down in the snow where we were. The storm continued until toward midnight, then ceased. By this time 2 of our feebler men and 3 of our women were dead, and others past moving and threatened with death. Our master was nearly beside himself. He stirred up the living, and made us stand, jump, slap ourselves to restore our circulation, and he helped as well as he could with his whip. Now came a diversion. We heard shrieks and yells, and soon a woman came running and crying, and seeing our group, she flung herself into our midst and begged for protection. A mob of people came tearing after her, some with torches, and said that she was a witch who had caused several cows to die by a strange disease, and practiced her arts by the help of a devil in the form of a black cat. This poor woman had been stoned until she hardly looked human. She was so battered and bloody. The mob wanted to burn her. Well, now, what do you suppose our master did? When we closed around this poor creature to shelter her, he saw his chance. He said, "Burn her here, or they shouldn't have her at all." Imagine that. They were willing. They fastened her to a post. They brought wood and piled it about her. They applied the torch while she shrieked and pleaded and strained her 2 young daughters to her breast. And our brute, with a heart solely for business, lashed us into position about the stake, and warmed us into life and commercial value by the same fire which took away the innocent life of that poor harmless mother. That was the sort of master we had. I took his number. That snowstorm cost him 9 of his flock, and he was more brutal to us than ever after that, for many days together. He was so enraged over his loss. We had adventures all along. One day we ran into a procession, And such a procession! All the riff-raff of the kingdom seemed to be comprehended in it, and all drunk at that. In the van was a cart with a coffin in it, and on the coffin sat a comely young girl of about 18 suckling a baby which she squeezed to her breast in a passion of love every little while, and every little while wiped from its face the tears which her eyes rained down upon it. And always the foolish little thing smiled up at her, happy and content, kneading her breast with its dimpled fat hand, which she patted and fondled right over her breaking heart. Men and women, boys and girls, trotted along beside or after the cart, hooting, shouting profane and ribald remarks, singing snatches of foul song, skipping, dancing, a very holiday of hellions, a snickering sight. We had struck a suburb of London, outside the walls, and this was a sample of one sort of London society. Our master secured a good place for us near the gallows. A priest was in attendance, and he helped the girl climb up, and said comforting words to her, and made the under-sheriff provide a stool for her. Then he stood there by her on the gallows, and for a moment looked down upon the mass of upturned faces at his feet, then out over the solid pavement of heads that stretched away on every side, occupying the vacancies far and near, and then began to tell the story of the case. And there was pity in his voice. How seldom a sound that was in the ignorant and savage land. I remember every detail of what he said, except the words he said it in, and so I change it into my own words. Law is intended to mete out justice. Sometimes it fails. This cannot be helped. We can only grieve and be resigned, and pray for the soul of him who falls unfairly by the arm of the law, and that his fellows may be few. A law sends this poor young thing to death, and it is right. But another law had placed her where she must commit her crime or starve with her child, and before God that law is responsible for both her crime and her ignominious death. A little while ago, this young thing, this child of 18 years, was as happy a wife and mother as any in England, and her lips were blithe with song, which is the native speech of glad and innocent hearts. Her young husband was as happy as she, for he was doing his whole duty. He worked early and late at his handicraft. His bread was honest bread, well and fairly earned. He was prospering. He was furnishing shelter and sustenance to his family. He was adding his mite to the wealth of the nation. By consent of a treacherous law, instant destruction fell upon this holy home and swept it away. That young husband was waylaid and impressed and sent to sea. The wife knew nothing of it. She sought him everywhere. She moved the hardest hearts with the supplication of her tears, the broken eloquence of her despair. Weeks dragged by, she watching, waiting, hoping, her mind going slowly to wreck under the burden of her misery. Little by little all her small possessions went for food. When she could no longer pay her rent, they turned her out of doors. She begged, while she had strength. When she was starving at last, and her milk failing, she stole a piece of linen cloth of the value of a fourth part of a cent, thinking to sell it and save her child. But she was seen by the owner of the cloth. She was put in jail and brought to trial. The man testified to the facts. A plea was made for her, and her sorrowful story was told in her behalf. She spoke, too, by permission, and said she did steal the cloth, but that her mind was so disordered of late by trouble, that when she was overborne with hunger all acts, criminal or other, swam meaningless through her brain, and she knew nothing rightly, except that she was so hungry. For a moment all were touched, and there was a disposition to deal mercifully with her, seeing that she was so young and friendless, and her case so piteous, and the law that robbed her of her support to blame as being the first and only cause of her transgression. But the proceeding officer replied that whereas these things were all true, and most pitiful as well, Still, there was much small theft in these days, and mistimed mercy here would be a danger to property. Oh, my God! Is there no property in ruined homes and orphaned babies and broken hearts that British law holds precious? And so he must require sentence. When the judge put on his black cap, the owner of the stolen linen rose trembling up, his lip quivering, his face as gray as ashes, and when the awful words came, he cried out, "Oh, poor child, I did not know it was death," and fell as a tree falls. When they lifted him up, his reason was gone. Before the sun was set, he had taken his own life. A kindly man, a man whose heart was right at bottom, add his murder to this that is to be now done here, and charge them both where they belong, to the rulers and the bitter laws of Britain. The time is come, my child. Let me pray over thee, not for thee, dear abused, poor heart and innocent, but for them that be guilty of thine ruin and death, who need it more. After his prayer they put the noose around the young girl's neck, and they had a great trouble to adjust the knot under her ear, because she was devouring the baby all the time, wildly kissing it, and snatching it to her face and her breast, and drenching it with tears, and half moaning, half shrieking all the while, and the baby crowing and laughing, and kicking its feet with delight over what it took for romp and play. Even the hangman couldn't stand it, but turned away. When all was ready, the priest gently pulled and tugged, and forced the child out of the mother's arms, and stepped quickly out of her reach. But she clasped her hands, and made a wild spring toward him, with a shriek, but the rope and the under-sheriff held her short. Then she went on her knees, and stretched out her hands, and cried, "One more kiss! Oh, my God, one more! One more! It is the dying that begs it!" She got it, and almost smothered the little thing. And when they got it away again, she cried out, "Oh, my child, my darling, it will die! It has no home! It has no father, no friend, no mother!" "It has them all," said that good priest. "All these will I be to it until I die." You should have seen her face then. Gratitude? Lord, what do you want with words to express that? Words are only painted fire. A look is the fire itself. She gave that look, and carried it away to the treasury of heaven, where all things that are divine belong. End of chapter 35. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 36. An Encounter in the Dark. London, to a slave, was a sufficiently interesting place. It was merely a great big village, and mainly mud and thatch. The streets were muddy, crooked, unpaved. The populace was an ever-flocking and drifting swarm of rags and splendors, of nodding plumes and shining armor. The king had a palace there. He saw the outside of it. It made him sigh, yes, and swear a little, in a poor, juvenile, 6th century way. We saw knights and grandees whom we knew, but they wouldn't know us in our rags and dirt, and raw welts and bruises, and wouldn't have recognized us if we had hailed them, nor stopped to answer either, it being unlawful to speak with slaves on a chain. Sandy passed within 10 yards of me on a mule, hunting for me, I imagined. But the thing which clean broke my heart was something which happened in front of our old barrack in a square, while we were enduring the spectacle of a man being boiled to death in oil for counterfeiting pennies. It was the sight of a newsboy, and I couldn't get at him. Still, I had one comfort. Here was proof that Clarence was still alive and banging away. I meant to be with him before long. The thought was full of cheer. I had one little glimpse of another thing one day, which gave me a great uplift. It was a wire stretching from housetop to housetop. Telegraph or telephone, sure. I did very much wish I had a little piece of it. It was just what I needed in order to carry out my project of escape. My idea was to get loose some night, along with the king, then gag and bind our master, change clothes with him, batter him into the aspect of a stranger, hitch him to the slave chain, assume possession of the property, march to Camelot, and— But you get my idea. You see what a stunning dramatic surprise I would wind up with at the palace. It was all feasible, if I could only get hold of a slender piece of iron which I could shape into a lock-pick. I could then undo the lumbering padlocks with which our chains were fastened, whenever I might choose. But I never had any luck. No such thing ever happened to fall in my way. However, my chance came at last. A gentleman who had come twice before to dicker for me, without result, or indeed any approach to a result, came again. I was far from expecting ever to belong to him, for the price asked for me from the time I was first enslaved was exorbitant, and always provoked either anger or derision, yet my master struck stubbornly to it, $22. He wouldn't bate a cent. The king was greatly admired, because of his grand physique, but his kingly style was against him, and he wasn't saleable. Nobody wanted that kind of a slave. I considered myself safe from parting with him because of my extravagant price. No, I was not expecting to ever belong to this gentleman whom I have spoken of, but he had something which I expected would belong to me eventually, if he would but visit us often enough. It was a steel thing with a long pin to it, with which his long cloth outside garment was fastened together in front. There were 3 of them. He had disappointed me twice, because he did not come quite close enough to me to make my project entirely safe, but this time I succeeded. I captured the lower clasp of the 3, and when he missed it he thought he had lost it on the way. I had a chance to be glad about a minute, then straightway a chance to be sad again. For when the purchase was about to fail, as usual, the master suddenly spoke up and said what would be worded thus in modern English: "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm tired of supporting these 2 for no good. Give me $22 for this one, and I'll throw the other one in." The king couldn't get his breath. He was in such a fury. He began to choke and gag, and meantime the master and the gentleman moved away, discussing. "And ye will keep the offer open? 'Tis open till the morrow at this hour." "Then I will answer you at that time," said the gentleman, and disappeared, the master following him. I had a time of it to cool the king down, but I managed it. I whispered in his ear to this effect: "Your grace will go for nothing, but after another fashion, and so shall I. Tonight we shall both be free." "Ah, how is that?" "With this thing which I have stolen. I will unlock these locks and cast off these chains tonight. When he comes about 9:30 to inspect us for the night, we will seize him, gag him, batter him, and early in the morning we will march out of this town proprietors of this caravan of slaves." That was as far as I went, but the king was charmed and satisfied. That evening we waited patiently for our fellow slaves to get to sleep, and signify it by the usual sign, for you must not take any chances on those poor fellows if you can avoid it. It is best to keep your own secrets. No doubt they fidgeted only about as usual, but it didn't seem so to me. It seemed to me that they were going to be forever getting down to their regular snoring. As the time dragged on, I got nervously afraid we shouldn't have enough of it left for our needs. So I made several premature attempts, and merely delayed things by it, for I couldn't seem to touch a padlock, there in the dark, without starting a rattle out of it which interrupted somebody's sleep, and made him turn over and wake some more of the gang. But finally I did get my last iron off, and was a free man once more. I took a good breath of relief and reached for the king's irons. Too late! In comes the master with a light in one hand and his heavy walking-staff in the other. I snuggled close among the wallows of snorers to conceal as nearly as possible that I was naked of irons, and I kept a sharp lookout and prepared to spring for my man the moment he should bend over me. But he didn't approach. He stopped, gazed absently toward our dusky mass a minute, evidently thinking about something else, then set down his light, moved musingly toward the door, and before a body could imagine what he was going to do, he was out the door and had closed it behind him. "Quick," said the king, "fetch him back." Of course it was the thing to do, and I was up and out in a moment, but, dear me, there were no lamps in those days, and it was a dark night. But I glimpsed a dim figure a few steps away. I darted for it, threw myself upon it, and then there was a state of things, and lively. We fought and scuffled and struggled, and drew a crowd in no time. They took an immense interest in the fight, and encouraged us all they could, and in fact couldn't have been pleasanter or more cordial about it if it had been their own fight. Then a tremendous row broke out behind us, and as much as half of our audience left us with a rush to invest some sympathy in that. Lanterns began to swing in all directions. It was the watch gathering from far and near. Presently a halberd fell across my back as a reminder, and I knew what it meant. I was in custody. So was my adversary. We were marched off toward prison, one on each side of the watchman. Here was disaster, for here was a fine scheme gone to sudden destruction. I tried to imagine what would happen when the master should discover that it was I who had been fighting him, and what would happen if they jailed us together in the general apartment for brawlers and petty lawbreakers, as was the custom, and what might— Just then my antagonist turned his face around in my direction. The freckled light from the watchman's tin lantern fell on it, and by George, he was the wrong man. End of chapter 36. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 37. An Awful Predicament. Sleep? It was impossible. It would naturally have been impossible in that noisome cavern of a jail, with its mangy crowd of drunken, quarrelsome, and song-singing rapscallions. But the thing that made sleep all the more a thing not to be dreamed of was my racking impatience to get out of this place and find out the whole size of what might have happened yonder in the slave quarters in consequence of that intolerable miscarriage of mine. It was a long night, but the morning got around at last. I made a full and frank explanation to the court. I said I was a slave, the property of the great Earl Grip, who had arrived just after dark at the Tabard Inn in the village on the other side of the water, and had stopped there overnight by compulsion, he being taken deadly sick with a strange and sudden disorder. I had been ordered to cross to the city in all haste and bring the best physician. I was doing my best, naturally. I was running with all my might. The night was dark. I ran against this common person here, who seized me by the throat and began to pummel me, although I told him my errand and implored him, for the sake of the great earl, my master's mortal peril. The common person interrupted and said it was a lie, and was going to explain how I rushed upon him and attacked him without a word. "Silence, sirrah!" from the court. "Take him hence and give him a few stripes whereby to teach him how to treat the servant of a nobleman after a different fashion another time. Go." Then the court begged my pardon, and hoped I would not fail to tell his lordship it was in no wise the court's fault that this high-handed thing had happened. I said I would make it all right, and so took my leave. Took it just in time, too. He was starting to ask me why I didn't fetch out these facts the moment I was arrested. I said I would if I had thought of it, which was true, but that I was so battered by that man that all my wit was knocked out of me, and so forth and so on, and got myself away, still mumbling. I didn't wait for breakfast. No grass grew under my feet. I was soon at the slave quarters. Empty. Everybody gone. That is, except one body. The slave master's. It lay there all battered to pulp, and all about were the evidence of a terrific fight. There was a rude board coffin on a cart at the door, and workmen, assisted by the police, were thinning a road through the gaping crowd in order that they might bring it in. I picked out a man humble enough in life to condescend to talk with one so shabby as I and got his account of the matter. There were 16 slaves here. They rose against their master in the night, and thou seest how it ended. Yes. How did it begin? There was no witness but the slaves. They said the slave that was most valuable got free of his bonds and escaped in some strange way. By magic arts, 'twas thought, by reason that he had no key, and the locks were neither broke nor in any wise injured. When the master discovered his loss, he was mad with despair, and threw himself upon his people with his heavy stick, who resisted and brake his back, and in other and divers ways did give him hurts that brought him swiftly to his end. This is dreadful. It will go hard with the slaves, no doubt, upon the trial. Marry, the trial is over. Over? Would they be a week, think you, and the matter so simple? They were not the half of a quarter of an hour at it. Why, I don't see how they could determine which were the guilty ones in so short a time. Which ones? Indeed, they considered not particularities like that. They condemned them in a body. Wit ye not the law? Which men say the Romans left behind them here when they went? That if one slave killeth his master, all the slaves of that man must die for it? True, I had forgotten. And when will these die? Belike within a 24 hours, albeit some say they will wait a pair of days more, if peradventure they may find the missing one meantime. The missing one. It made me feel uncomfortable. It is likely they will find him. Before the day is spent, yes. They seek him everywhere. They stand at the gates of the town, with certain of the slaves who will discover him to them if he cometh, and none can pass out but he will first be examined. Might one see the place where the rest are confined? The outside of it, yes. The inside of it, but ye will not want to see that. I took the address of that prison for future reference, and then sauntered off. At the first second-hand clothing shop I came to, up a back street, I got a rough rig suitable for a common seaman who might be going on a cold voyage, and bound up my face with a liberal bandage, saying I had a toothache. This concealed my worst bruises. It was a transformation. I no longer resembled my former self. Then I struck out for that wire, found it, and followed it to its den. It was a little room over a butcher's shop, which meant that business wasn't very brisk in the telegraphic line. The young chap in charge was drowsing at his table. I locked the door and put the vast key in my bosom. This alarmed the young fellow, and he was going to make a noise, but I said, "Save your wind. If you open your mouth, you are dead, sure. Tackle your instrument. Lively now. Call Camelot." "This doth amaze me. How should such as you know aught of such matters as—" "Call Camelot. I'm a desperate man. Call Camelot, or get away from the instrument, and I will do it myself." "What? You?" "Yes, certainly. Stop gabbling. Call the palace." He made the call. "Now then, call Clarence." "Clarence who?" "Never mind Clarence who. Say you want Clarence. You'll get an answer." He did so. We waited 5 nerve-straining minutes, 10 minutes. How long it did seem! And then came a click that was as familiar to me as a human voice, for Clarence had been my own pupil. "Now, my lad, vacate." They would have known my touch maybe, and so your call was surest, but I'm all right now. He vacated the place and cocked his ear to listen, but it didn't win. I used a cipher. I didn't waste any time in sociabilities with Clarence, but squared away for business, straight off, thus: "The king is here and in danger. We were captured and brought here as slaves. We should not be able to prove our identity, and the fact is, I am not in a position to try. Send a telegram for the palace here, which will carry conviction with it." His answer came straight back: "They don't know anything about the telegraph. They haven't had any experience yet. The line to London is so new. Better not venture that. They might hang you. Think up something else." Might hang us. Little he knew how closely he was crowding the facts. I couldn't think up anything for the moment. Then an idea struck me, and I started it along. "Send 500 picked knights with Lancelot in the lead, and send them on the jump. Let them enter by the southwest gate, and look out for the man with a white cloth around his right arm." The answer was prompt: "They shall start in half an hour." "All right, Clarence. Now tell this lad here that I'm a friend of yours and a deadhead, and that he must be discreet and say nothing about this visit of mine." The instrument began to talk to the youth, and I hurried away. I fell to ciphering. In half an hour it would be 9 o'clock. Knights and horses in heavy armor couldn't travel very fast. They would make the best time they could, and now that the ground was in good condition and no snow or mud, they would probably make a 7-mile gait. They would have to change horses a couple of times. They would arrive about 6, or a little after. It would still be plenty light enough. They would see the white cloth which I should tie around my right arm, and I would take command. We would surround that prison and have the king out in no time. It would be showy and picturesque enough, all things considered, though I would have preferred noonday, on account of the more theatrical aspect the thing would have. Now, then, in order to increase the strings in my bow, I thought I would look up some of those people whom I had formerly recognized, and make myself known. That would help us out of our scrape, without the knights. But I must proceed cautiously, for it was a risky business. I must get into sumptuous raiment, and it wouldn't do it to run and jump into it. No, I must work up to it by degrees, buying suit after suit of clothes in shops wide apart, and getting a little finer article with each change, until I should finally reach silk and velvet, and be ready for my project. So I started. But the scheme fell through like scat. The first corner I turned, I came plumb upon one of our slaves snooping around with a watchman. I coughed at the moment, and he gave me a sudden look that bit right into my marrow. I judge he thought he had heard that cough before. I turned immediately into a shop and worked along down the counter, pricing things and watching out of the corner of my eye. Those people had stopped, and were talking together and looking at the door. I made up my mind to get out the back way, if there was a back way, and I asked the shopwoman if I could step out there and look for the escaped slave, who was believed to be in hiding back there somewhere, and said I was an officer in disguise, and my pard was yonder at the door with one of the murderers in charge, and would she be good enough to step there and tell him he needn't wait, but had better go at once to the further end of the back alley and be ready to head him off when I rousted him out. She was blazing with eagerness to see one of those already celebrated murderers, and she started on the errand at once. I slipped out the back way and locked the door behind me, put the key in my pocket, and started off, chuckling to myself and comfortable. Well, I had gone and spoiled it again, made another mistake, a double one, in fact. There were plenty of ways to get rid of that officer by some simple and plausible device, but no, I must pick out a picturesque one, and it is the crying deficit of my character. And then I had ordered my procedure upon what the officer, being human, would naturally do, whereas, when you are least expecting it, a man will now and then go and do the very thing which is not natural for him to do. The natural thing for the officer to do, in this case, was to follow straight on my heels. He would find a stout oaken door, securely locked, between him and me. Before he could break it down, I should be far and away engaged in slipping into a succession of baffling disguises, which would soon get me into a sort of raiment which was surer protection from meddling law-dogs in Britain than any amount of mere innocence and purity of character. But instead of doing the natural thing, the officer took me at my word, and followed my instructions. And so, as I came trotting out of that cul-de-sac, full of satisfaction with my own cleverness, he turned the corner, and I walked right into his handcuffs. If I had known it was a cul-de-sac... However, there isn't any excusing a blunder like that. Let it go. Charge it up to profit and loss. Of course, I was indignant, and swore I had just come ashore from a long voyage, and all that sort of thing, just to see, if it would deceive that slave. But it didn't. He knew me. When I reproached him for betraying me, he was more surprised than hurt. He stretched his eyes wide, and said, "What? Wouldst have me let thee, of all men, escape and not hang with us, when thou'rt the very cause of our hanging? Go to." Go to is their way of saying, "I should smile," or "I like that." Queer talkers, those people. Well, there was a sort of bastard justice in his view of the case, and so I dropped the matter. When you can't cure a disaster by argument, what is the use to argue? It isn't my way. So I only said, "You are not going to be hanged. None of us are." Both men laughed, and the slave said, "Ye have not ranked as a fool before. You might better keep your reputation, seeing the strain would not be for long." "It will stand it, I reckon. Before tomorrow we shall be out of prison, and free to go where we will besides." The witty officer lifted his left ear with his thumb, made a rasping noise in his throat, and said, "Out of prison, yes, ye say true, and free likewise to go where ye will, so ye wander not out of his grace the devil's sultry realm." I kept my temper and said indifferently, "Now I suppose you really think we are going to hang within a day or two?" "I thought it not many minutes ago, for so the thing was decided and proclaimed." "Ah, then you've changed your mind, is that it?" "Even that. I only thought then, I know now." I felt sarcastical, so I said, "O sapient servant of the law, condescend to tell us, then, what you know." "That ye will be hanged today at mid-afternoon." "Oh, that shot hit home. Lean upon me." "The fact is, I did need to lean upon somebody. My knights couldn't arrive in time. They would be as much as 3 hours too late. Nothing in the world could save the King of England, nor me, which was more important. More important not merely to me, but to the nation, the only nation on earth standing ready to blossom into civilization." I was sick. I said no more. There wasn't anything to say. I knew what the man meant, that if the missing slave was found, the postponement would be revoked, the execution take place today. Well, the missing slave was found. End of chapter 37. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 38. Sir Lancelot and Knights to the Rescue. Nearing 4 in the afternoon, the scene was just outside the walls of London. A cool, comfortable, superb day with a brilliant sun. The kind of day to make one want to live, not die. The multitude was prodigious and far-reaching, and yet we 15 poor devils hadn't a friend in it. There was something painful in that thought. Look at it how you might. There we sat, on our tall scaffold, the butt of the hate and mockery of all those enemies. We were being made a holiday spectacle. They had built a sort of grandstand for the nobility and gentry, and these were there in full force with their ladies. We recognized a good many of them. The crowd got a brief and unexpected dash of diversion out of the king. The moment we were freed of our bonds, he sprang up in his fantastic rags, with face bruised out of all recognition, and proclaimed himself Arthur, King of Britain, and denounced the awful penalties of treason upon every soul there present if hair of his sacred head were touched. It startled and surprised him to hear them break into a vast roar of laughter. It wounded his dignity, and he locked himself up in silence. Then, although the crowd begged him to go on, and tried to provoke him to it by catcalls, jeers, and shouts of, "Let him speak! The king! The king! His humble subjects hunger and thirst for words of wisdom out of the mouth of their master, his serene and sacred raggedness." But it went for nothing. He put on all his majesty, and sat under this rain of contempt and insult unmoved. He certainly was great in his way. Absently I had taken off my white bandage and wound it around my right arm. When the crowd noticed this, they began upon me. They said, "Doubtless this sailor man is his minister. Observe his costly badge of office." I let them go on until they got tired, and then I said, "Yes, I am his minister, the boss. And tomorrow you will hear that from Camelot, which—" I got no further. They drowned me out with joyous derision. But presently there was silence, for the sheriffs of London, in their official robes, with their subordinates, began to make a stir which indicated that business was about to begin. In the hush which followed, our crime was recited, the death warrant read, then everybody uncovered while a priest uttered a prayer. Then a slave was blindfolded, the hangman unslung his rope. There lay the smooth road before us, we upon one side of it, the banked multitude wailing its other side, a good, clear road, and kept free by the police. How good it would be to see my 500 horsemen come tearing down it! But no, it was out of the possibilities. I followed its receding thread out into the distance, not a horseman on it, or a sign of one. There was a jerk, and the slave hung dangling and hideously squirming, for his limbs were not tied. A second rope was unslung. In a moment another slave was dangling. In a minute a third slave was struggling in the air. It was dreadful. I turned away my head a moment, and when I turned back I was missing the king. They were blindfolding him. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I was choking. My tongue was petrified. They finished blindfolding him. They led him under the rope. I couldn't shake off that clinging impotence. But when I saw them put the noose around his neck, then everything let go in me, and I sprang a spring to the rescue. And as I made it, I shot one more glance abroad. By George, here they came, a-tilting! 500 mailed and belted knights on bicycles. The grandest sight that ever was seen. Lord, how the plumes streamed, how the sun flamed and flashed from the endless procession of webby wheels. I waved my right arm as Lancelot slept in. He recognized my rag. I tore away noose and bandage and shouted, "On your knees, every rascal of you, and salute the king! Who fails shall sup in hell tonight." I always use that high style when I'm climaxing an effect. It was noble to see Lancelot and the boys swarm up onto that scaffold and heave sheriffs and such overboard. And it was fine to see that astonished multitude go down on their knees and beg their lives of the king they had just been deriding and insulting. And as he stood apart there, receiving his homage in rags, I thought to myself, well, really there is something particularly grand about the gait and bearing of a king, after all. I was immensely satisfied. Take the whole situation all around, it was one of the gaudiest effects I ever instigated. And presently up comes Clarence, his own self, and winks and says, very modernly, "Good deal of a surprise, wasn't it? I knew you'd like it. I've had the boys practicing this long time privately and just hungry for a chance to show off." End Chapter 38. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. This is Chapter 39. The Yankees Fight with the Knights. Home again at Camelot, a morning or two later I found the paper, damp from the press, by my plate at the breakfast table. I turned to the advertising columns, knowing I should find something of personal interest to me there. It was this: De par le Roi. Know that the great lord and illustrious knight, Sir Sagramore de Desirius, having condescended to meet the king's minister, Hank Morgan, the which is surnamed the Boss, for satisfaction of offence anciently given, these will engage in the lists of Camelot about the 4th hour of the morning of the 16th day of this next succeeding month. The battle will be a one outance, sith the said offence was of a deadly sort, admitting of no composition. De par le Roi. Clarence's editorial reference to this affair was to this effect: It will be observed, by a glance at our advertising columns, that the community is to be favored with a treat of unusual interest in the tournament line. The names of the artists are warrant of good entertainment. The box office will be open at noon of the 13th. Admission 3 cents. Reserved seats 5. Proceeds to go to the hospital fund. The royal pair with all the court will be present, with these exceptions, and the press and the clergy. The free list is strictly suspended. Parties are hereby warned against buying tickets of speculators. They will not be good at the door. Everybody knows and likes the boss. Everybody knows and likes Sir Sag. Come, let us give the lads a good send-off. Remember, the proceeds go to a great and free charity, and one whose broad benevolence stretches out its helping hand, warm with the blood of a loving heart, to all that suffer, regardless of race, creed, condition, or color. The only charity yet established in the earth which has no politico-religious stopcock on its compassion, but always says, "Here flows the stream, let all come and drink." Turn out, all hands. Fetch along your doughnuts and your gumdrops, and have a good time. Pie for sale on the grounds, and rocks to crack it with, and circus lemonade, 3 drops of lime juice to a barrel of water. N.B. This is the first tournament under the new law, which allow each combatant to use any weapon he may prefer. You may want to make a note of that. Up to the day set, there was no talk in all Britain of anything but this combat. All other topics sank into insignificance and passed out of men's thoughts and interest. It was not because a tournament was a great matter. It was not because Sir Sagramor had found the Holy Grail, for he had not, but had failed. It was not because the second official personage in the kingdom was one of the duelists. No, all these features were commonplace. Yet there was abundant reason for the extraordinary interest which this coming fight was creating. It was born of the fact that all the nation knew that this was not to be a duel between mere men, so to speak, but a duel between 2 mighty magicians, a duel not of muscle but of mind, not of human skill but of superhuman art and craft, a final struggle for supremacy between the 2 master enchanters of the age. It was realized that the most prodigious achievements of the most renowned knights could not be worthy of comparison with a spectacle like this. They could be but child's play, contrasted with this mysterious and awful battle of the gods. Yes, all the world knew it was going to be in reality a duel between Merlin and me, a measuring of his magic powers against mine. It was known that Merlin had been busy whole days and nights together imbuing Sir Sagramor's arms and armor with supernatural powers of offense and defense, and that he had procured for him, from the spirits of the air, a fleecy veil which would render the wearer invisible to his antagonist, while still visible to other men. Against Sir Sagramor, so weaponed and protected, 1,000 knights could accomplish nothing. Against him, no known enchantments could prevail. These facts were sure. Regarding them, there was no doubt, no reason for doubt. There was but one question. Might there be still other enchantments unknown to Merlin, which could render Sir Sagramor's veil transparent to me, and make his enchanted mail vulnerable to my weapons? This was the one thing to be decided in the lists. Until then, the world must remain in suspense. So the world thought there was a vast matter at stake here. And the world was right, but it was not the one they had in their minds. No, a far vaster one was upon the cast of this die. The life of knight-errantry. I was a champion. It was true, but not the champion of the frivolous black arts. I was the champion of hard, unsentimental common sense and reason. I was entering the lists to either destroy knight-errantry or be its victim. Vast as the showgrounds were, there were no vacant spaces in them outside of the lists, at 10 o'clock on the morning of the 16th. The mammoth grandstand was clothed in flags, streamers, and rich tapestries, and packed with several acres of small-fry tributary kings, their suites, and the British aristocracy, with our own royal gang in the chief place, and each and every individual a flashing prism of gaudy silks and velvets. Well, I never saw anything to begin with it but a fight between an upper Mississippi sunset and the aurora borealis. The huge camp of beflagged and gray-colored tents at one end of the lists, with a stiff-standing sentinel at every door, and a shining shield hanging by him for challenge, was another fine sight. You see, Every knight was there who had any ambition or any caste feeling, for my feeling toward their order was not much of a secret, and so here was their chance. If I won my fight with Sir Sagramor, others would have the right to call me out as long as I might be willing to respond. Down at our end there were but 2 tents, one for me and another for my servants. At the appointed hour the king made a sign, and the heralds, in their tabards, appeared and made proclamation, naming the combatants and stating the cause of quarrel. Then there was a pause, then a ringing bugle blast, which was the signal for us to come forth. All the multitude caught their breath, and an eager curiosity flashed into every face. Out from his tent rode great Sir Sagramor, an imposing tower of iron, stately and rigid, his huge spear standing upright in its socket and grasped in his strong hand, his grand horse's face and breast cased in steel, his body clothed in rich trappings that almost dragged the ground. Oh, a most noble picture. A great shout went up, of welcome and admiration. And then out I came, but I didn't get any shout. There was a wondering and eloquent silence for a moment. Then a great wave of laughter began to sweep along that human sea, but a warning bugle blast cut its career short. I was in the simplest and comfortablest of gymnast costumes, flesh-colored tights from neck to heel, with blue silk puffings about my loins, and bareheaded. My horse was not above medium size, but he was alert, slender-limbed, muscled with watch springs, and just a greyhound to go. He was a beauty, glossy as silk, and naked as he was when he was born, except for a bridle and ranger saddle. The iron tower and gorgeous bedquilt came cumbrously but gracefully pirouetting down the lists, and we tripped lightly up to meet them. We halted. The tower saluted. I responded. Then we wheeled and rode side by side to the grandstand and faced our king and queen, to whom we made obeisance. The queen exclaimed, "Alack, Sir Boss, wilt fight naked, and without lance or sword, or—" But the king checked her and made her understand, with a polite phrase or two, that this was none of her business. The bugles rang again, and we separated and rode to the ends of the lists and took our position. Now old Merlin stepped into view and cast a dainty web of gossamer threads over Sir Sagramor, which turned him into Hamlet's ghost. The king made a sign. The bugles blew. Sir Sagramor laid his great lance in rest, and the next moment here he came, thundering down the course with his veil flying out behind, and I went whistling through the air like an arrow to meet him, cocking my ear the while, as if noting the invisible knight's position and progress by hearing, not sight. A chorus of encouraging shouts burst out for him, and one brave voice flung out a heartening word for me, said, "Go it, Slim Jim!" It was an even bet that Clarence had procured that favor for me, and furnished the language, too. When that formidable lance-point was within 1.5 yards of my breast, I twitched my horse aside without an effort, and the big knight swept by, scoring a blank. I got plenty of applause that time. We turned, braced up, and down we came again. Another blank for the knight, a roar of applause for me. The same thing was repeated once more, and it fetched such a whirlwind of applause that Sir Sagramor lost his temper, and at once changed his tactics, and set himself the task of chasing me down. Why, he hadn't any show in the world at that. It was a game of tag, with all the advantage on my side. I whirled out of his path with ease whenever I chose, and once I slapped him on the back as I went to the rear. Finally I took the chase into my own hands, and after that, turn or twist or do what he would, he was never able to get behind me again. He found himself always in front at the end of his maneuver. So he gave up that business and retired to his end of the lists. His temper was clear gone now, and he forgot himself and flung an insult at me which disposed of mine. I slipped my lasso from the horn of my saddle and grasped the coil in my right hand. This time you should have seen him come. It was a business trip, sure. By his gait there was blood in his eye. I was sitting my horse at ease, and swinging the great loop of my lasso in wide circles about my head. The moment he was under way I started for him. When the space between us had narrowed to 40 feet, I sent the snaky spirals of rope a-cleaving through the air. then darted aside and faced about and brought my trained animal to a halt with all its feet braced under him for a surge. The next moment the rope sprang taut and yanked Sir Sagramor out of the saddle. Great Scott, but there was a sensation! Unquestionably, the popular thing in this world is novelty. These people had never seen anything of that cowboy business before, and it carried them clear off their feet with delight. From all around and everywhere the shout went up, "Encore! Encore!" I wondered where they got the word, but there was no time to cipher it on philological matters, because the whole knight-errantry hive was just humming now, and my prospect for trade couldn't have been better. The moment my lasso was released and Sir Sagramor had been assisted to his tent, I hauled in the slack, took my station, and began to swing my loop around my head again. I was sure to have use for it as soon as they could elect a successor for Sir Sagramor, and that couldn't take long where there were so many hungry candidates. Indeed, they elected one straight off, Sir Hervis de Revel. Bzzz! Here he came like a house afire. I dodged. He passed like a flash, with my horsehair coils settling around his neck. A second or so later, his saddle was empty. I got another encore, and another, and still another. When I had snaked 5 men out, things began to look serious to the ironclads, and they stopped and consulted together. As a result, they decided that it was time to waive etiquette and send their greatest and best against me. To the astonishment of that little world, I lassoed Sir Lamorak de Galis, and after him Sir Galahad. You see, there was simply nothing to be done now but play their right bower, bringing out the superbest of the superb, the mightiest of the mighty, the great Sir Lancelot himself. A proud moment for me? I should think so. Yonder was Arthur, King of Britain. Yonder was Guinevere. Yes, and whole tribes of little provincial kings and kinglets. And in the tented camp yonder, renowned knights from many lands, and likewise the selectest body known to chivalry, the Knights of the Round Table, the most illustrious in Christendom. And biggest fact of all, the very sun of their shining system was yonder, couching his lance, the focal point of 40,000 adoring eyes, and all by myself. Here was I laying for him. Across my mind flitted the dear image of a certain hello girl of West Hartford, and I wished she could see me now. In that moment, down came the Invincible, with the rush of a whirlwind. The courtly world rose to its feet and bent forward. The fateful coils went circling through the air, and before you could wink, I was towing Sir Lancelot across the field on his back, and kissing my hand to the storm of waving handkerchiefs and thunder crash of applause that greeted me. Said I to myself as I coiled my lariat and hung it on my saddle horn, and sat there drunk with glory. The victory is perfect. No other will venture against me. Knight-errantry is dead. Now, imagine my astonishment, and everybody else's too, to hear that peculiar bugle call which announces that another competitor is about to enter the lists. There was a mystery here. I couldn't account for this thing. Next I noticed Merlin gliding away from me, and then I noticed that my lasso was gone. The old sleight-of-hand expert had stolen it, sure, and slipped it under his robe. The bugle blew again. I looked, and down came Sagramor riding again, with his dust brushed off and his veil nicely rearranged. I trotted up to meet him and pretended to find him by the sound of his horse's hoofs. He said, "Thou art quick of ear, but it will not save thee from this." He touched the hilt of his great sword. "And ye are not able to see it, because of the influence of the veil. Know that it is no cumbrous lance, but a sword, and I ween ye will not be able to avoid it." His visor was up. There was death in his smile. I should never be able to dodge his sword, that was plain. Somebody was going to die this time. If he got the drop on me, I could name the corpse. We rode forward together and saluted the royalties. This time the king was disturbed. He said, "Where is thy strange weapon?" "It is stolen, sire." "Hast another at hand?" "No, sire, I brought only the one." Then Merlin mixed in, "He brought but the one because there was but one to bring. There exists none other but that one. It belongeth to the king of the demons of the sea. This man is a pretender and ignorant, else he had known that that weapon can be used in but 8 bouts only, and then it vanisheth away to its home under the sea. Then is he weaponless, said the king. Sir Sagramore, ye will grant him leave to borrow. And I will lend, said Sir Lancelot, limping up. He is as brave a knight of his hands as any that be on live, and he shall have mine. He put his hand on his sword to draw it, but Sir Sagramore said, Stay, it may not be. He shall fight with his own weapons. It was his privilege to choose them and bring them. If he has erred, on his head be it. Knight, said the king, thou art overwrought with passion. It disorders thy mind. Wouldst thou kill a naked man? An he do it, he shall answer it to me, said Sir Lancelot. I will answer it to any he that desireth, retorted Sir Sagramore hotly. Merlin broke in, rubbing his hands and smiling his low downest smile of malicious gratification. "'Tis well said, right well said, and 'tis enough ye parleying. Let my lord the king deliver the battle signal." The king had to yield. The bugle made proclamation, and we turned apart and rode to our stations. There we stood, 100 yards apart, facing each other, rigid and motionless, like horsed statues. And so we remained in a soundless hush as much as a full minute. Everybody gazing, nobody stirring. It seemed as if the king could not take heart to give the signal. But at last he lifted his hand. The clear note of the bugle followed. Sir Sagramore's long blade described a flashing curve in the air, and it was superb to see him come. I sat still. On he came. I did not move. People got so excited that they shouted to me, "Fly, fly, save thyself, this is murther!" I never budged so much as an inch till that thundering apparition had got within 15 paces of me. Then I snatched a dragoon revolver out of my holster. There was a flash and a roar, and the revolver was back in the holster before anybody could tell what had happened. Here was a riderless horse plunging by, and yonder lay Sir Sagramore, stone dead. The people that ran to him were stricken dumb to find that the life was actually gone out of the man, and no reason for it visible, no hurt upon his body, nothing like a wound. There was a hole through the breast of his chain mail, but they attached no importance to a little thing like that. And as a bullet wound there produces but little blood, none came in sight because of the clothing and swaddlings under the armor. The body was dragged over to let the king and the swells look down upon it. They were stupefied with astonishment, naturally. I was requested to come and explain the miracle, but I remained in my tracks, like a statue, and said, "If it is a command, I will come, but my lord the king knows that I am where the laws of combat require me to remain, while any desire to come against me." I waited. Nobody challenged. Then I said, "If there are any who doubt that this field is well and fairly won, I do not wait for them to challenge me, I challenge them." "It is a gallant offer," said the king, "and well beseems you. Whom will you name first?" "I name none. I challenge all. Here I stand, and dare the chivalry of England to come against me, not by individuals, but in mass." "What?" shouted a score of knights. "You have heard the challenge. Take it, or I proclaim you recreant knights and vanquished, every one." It was a bluff, you know. At such a time it is sound judgment to put on a bold face and play your hand for 100 times what it is worth. 49 times out of 50 nobody dares to call, and you rake in the chips. But just this once, well, things looked squally. In just no time 500 knights were scrambling in their saddles, and before you could wink a wildly scattering drove were under way and clattering down upon me. I snatched both revolvers from the holsters and began to measure distances and calculate chances. Bang! One saddle empty. Bang! Another one. Bang! Bang! And I bagged two. Well, it was nip and tuck with us, and I knew it. If I spent the 7th shot without convincing these people, the 12th man would kill me, sure. And so I never did feel so happy as I did when my 9th downed its man, and I detected the wavering in the crowd which is premonitory of panic. An instant lost now could knock out my last chance, but I didn't lose it. I raised both revolvers and pointed them. The halted host stood their ground just about one good square moment, and then broke and fled. The day was mine. Knight-errantry was a doomed institution. The march of civilization was begun. How did I feel? You could never imagine it. And Brer Merlin? His stock was flat again. Somehow, every time the magic of fol-de-rol tried conclusions with the magic of science, the magic of fol-de-rol got left. End. Chapter 39. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 40. 3 years later. When I broke the back of knight-errantry that time, I no longer felt obliged to work in secret. So the very next day I exposed my hidden schools, my mines, and my vast system of clandestine factories and workshops to an astonished world. That is to say, I exposed the 19th century to the inspection of the 6th. Well, it is always a good plan to follow up an advantage promptly. The knights were temporarily down, but if I would keep them so, I must simply paralyze them. Nothing short of that would answer. You see, I was bluffing that last time in the field. It would be natural for them to work around to that conclusion if I gave them the chance. So I must not give them time, and I didn't. I renewed my challenge, and engraved it on brass, posted it up where any priest could read it to them, and also kept it standing in the advertising columns of the paper. I not only renewed it, but added to its proportions. I said, "Name the day, and I would take 50 assistants and stand up against the mass chivalry of the whole earth and destroy it." I was not bluffing this time. I meant what I said. I could do what I promised. Well, there wasn't any way to misunderstand the language of that challenge. Even the dullest of the chivalry perceived that this was a plain case of put up or shut up. They were wise and did the latter. In all the next 3 years they gave me no trouble worth mentioning. Consider the 3 years sped. Now look around on England. A happy and prosperous country, and strangely altered. Schools everywhere, and several colleges. A number of pretty good newspapers. Even authorship was taking a start. Sir Dinadan the humorist was first in the field, with a volume of grey-headed jokes which I had been familiar with during 13 centuries. If he had left out that old rancid one about the lecturer, I wouldn't have said anything. But I couldn't stand that one. I suppressed the book and hanged the author. Slavery was dead and gone. All men were equal before the law. Taxation had been equalized. The telegraph, telephone, the phonograph, the typewriter, the sewing machine, and all the 1,000 willing and handy servants of steam and electricity were working their way into favor. We had a steamboat or two on the Thames. We had steam warships, and the beginnings of a steam commercial marine. I was getting ready to send out an expedition to discover America. We were building several lines of railway, and our line from Camelot to London was already finished and in operation. I was shrewd enough to make all offices connected with the passenger service places of high and distinguished honor. My idea was to attract the chivalry and nobility, and make them useful and keep them out of mischief. The plan worked very well. The competition for the places was hot. The conductor of the 433 Express was a duke. There wasn't a passenger conductor on the line below the degree of earl. They were good men, every one. But they had 2 defects which I couldn't cure, and so had to wink at. They wouldn't lay aside their armor, and they would knock down fare. I mean, rob the company. There was hardly a knight in all the land who wasn't in some useful employment. They were going from end to end of the country in all manner of useful missionary capacities. Their penchant for wandering and their experience in it made them altogether the most effective spreaders of civilization we had. They went clothed in steel and equipped with sword and lance and battle-axe, and if they couldn't persuade a person to try a sewing machine on the installment plan, or a melodeon, or a barbed-wire fence, or a prohibition journal, or any of the other 1,001 things they canvassed for. They removed him and passed on. I was very happy. Things were working steadily toward a secretly longed-for point. You see, I had two schemes in my head which were the vastest of all my projects. The one was to overthrow the Catholic Church and set up the Protestant faith on its ruins. Not as an established church, but as a go-as-you-please one. And the other project was to get a decree issued by and by, commanding that upon Arthur's death unlimited suffrage should be introduced and given to men and women alike, at any rate to all men, wise or unwise, and to all mothers who at middle age should be found to know nearly as much as their sons at 21. Arthur was good for 30 years yet, he being about my own age, that is to say 40, and I believe that in that time I could easily have the active part of the population of that day ready and eager for an event which should be the first of its kind in the history of the world, a rounded and complete governmental revolution without bloodshed, the result to be a republic. Well, I may as well confess, though I do feel ashamed when I think of it, I was beginning to have a base hankering to be its first president myself. Yes, there was more or less human nature in me. I found that out. Clarence was with me as concerned the revolution, but in a modified way. His idea was a republic, without privileged orders, but with a hereditary royal family at the head of it, instead of an elective chief magistrate. He believed that no nation that had ever known the joy of worshipping a royal family could ever be robbed of it and not fade away and die of melancholy. I urged that kings were dangerous. He said, then have cats. He was sure that a royal family of cats would answer every purpose. They would be as useful as any other royal family. They would know as much. They would have the same virtues and the same treacheries, the same disposition to get up shindies with other royal cats. They would be laughably vain and absurd and never know it. They would be wholly inexpensive. Finally, they would have as sound a divine right as any other royal house. And Tom the Seventh, or Tom the 11th, or Tom the 14th, by the grace of God King, would sound as well as it would when applied to the ordinary royal tomcat with tights on. As a rule, said he, in his neat modern English, the character of these cats would be considerably above the character of the average king, and this would be an immense moral advantage to the nation, for the reason that a nation always models its morals after its monarch. The worship of royalty being founded in unreason, these graceful and harmless cats would easily become as sacred as any other royalties, and indeed more so, because it would presently be noticed that they hanged nobody, beheaded nobody, imprisoned nobody, inflicted no cruelties or injustices of any sort, and so must be worthy of a deeper love and reverence than the customary human being, and would certainly get it. The eyes of the whole harried world would be fixed upon this humane and gentle system, and royal butchers would presently begin to despair. Their subjects would fill the vacancies with catlings from our own royal house. We should become a factory. We should supply the thrones of the world. Within 40 years all Europe would be governed by cats, and we should furnish the cats. The reign of universal peace would begin then, and end no more forever. Meow, wow, wow. Hang him. I supposed he was in earnest, and was beginning to be persuaded by him until he exploded with that cat howl and started me almost out of my clothes. But he never could be in earnest. He didn't know what it was. He had pictured a distinct and perfectly rational and feasible improvement upon constitutional monarchy, but he was too feather-headed to know it, or care anything about it either. I was going to give him a scolding, but Sandy came flying in at that moment with wild terror, and so choked with sobs for a minute that she could not get her voice. I ran and took her in my arms, and lavished caresses upon her, and said beseechingly, "Speak, darling, speak! What is it?" Her head fell limp upon my bosom, and she gasped, almost inaudibly, "Hello, Central!" "Quick!" I shouted to Clarence. "Telephone the king's homeopath to come." In 2 minutes I was kneeling by the child's crib, and Sandy was dispatching servants here, there, and everywhere, all over the palace. I took in the situation almost at a glance. Membranous croup. I bent down and whispered, "Wake up, sweetheart. Hello, Central." She opened her soft eyes languidly, and made out to say, "Papa." That was a comfort. She was far from dead yet. I sent for preparations of sulphur. I rousted out the croup kettle myself, for I don't sit and wait for doctors when Sandy or the child is sick. I knew how to nurse both of them, and had had experience. This little chap had lived in my arms a good part of its small life, and often I could soothe away its troubles, and get it to laugh through the tear-dews on its eyelashes, when even its mother couldn't. Sir Lancelot, in his richest armor, came striding along the great hall now on his way to the stock-board. He was the president of the stock-board, and occupied the Siege Perilous, which he had bought of Sir Galahad, for the stock-board consisted of the Knights of the Round Table, and they used the Round Table for business purposes now. Seats at it were worth— well, you would never believe the figure, so it's no use to state it. Sir Lancelot was a bear, and he had put up a corner in one of the new lines, and was just getting ready to squeeze the shorts today. But what of that? He was the same old Lancelot, and when he glanced in as he was passing the door and found out that his pet was sick, that was enough for him. Bulls and bears might fight it out their own way for all him. He would come right in here and stand by little Hello Central for all he was worth. And that was what he did. He shied his helmet into the corner, and in half a minute he had a new wick in the alcohol lamp and was firing up on the croup kettle. By this time Sandy had built a blanket canopy over the crib, and everything was ready. Sir Lancelot got up steam. He and I loaded up the kettle with unslacked lime and carbolic acid, with a touch of lactic acid added thereto, then filled the thing up with water and inserted the steam spout under the canopy. Everything was ship-shape now, and we sat down on either side of the crib to stand our watch. Sandy was so grateful, and so comforted, that she charged a couple of churchwardens with willow bark and sumac tobacco for us, and told us to smoke as much as we pleased. It couldn't get under the canopy, and she was used to smoke, being the first lady in the land who had ever seen a cloud blown. Well, there couldn't be a more contented or comfortable sight than Sir Lancelot in his noble armor, sitting in gracious serenity at the end of a yard of snowy churchwarden. He was a beautiful man, a lovely man, and was just intended to make a wife and children happy, but of course Guinevere. However, it's no use to cry over what's done and can't be helped. Well, he stood watch and watch with me, right straight through, for 3 days and nights, till the child was out of danger. Then he took her up in his great arms and kissed her, with his plumes falling about her golden head. Then he laid her softly in Sandy's lap again, and took his stately way down the vast hall, between the ranks of admiring men-at-arms and menials, and so disappeared. And no instinct warned me that I should never look upon him again in this world. Lord, what a world of heartbreak it is. The doctor said we must take the child away if we would coax her back to health and strength again, and she must have sea air. So we took a man-of-war and a suite of 260 persons, and went cruising about. And after a fortnight of this we stepped ashore on the French coast, and the doctors thought it would be a good idea to make something of a stay there. The little king of that region offered us his hospitalities, and we were glad to accept. If he had had as many conveniences as he lacked, we should have been plenty comfortable enough. Even as it was, we made out very well in his queer old castle, by the help of comforts and luxuries from the ship. At the end of a month I sent the vessel home for fresh supplies and for news. We expected to hear back in 3 or 4 days. She would bring me, along with other news, the result of a certain experiment which I had been starting. It was a project of mine to replace the tournament with something which might furnish an escape for the extra steam of the chivalry, keep those bucks entertained and out of mischief, and at the same time preserve the best thing in them, which was their hearty spirit of emulation. I had had a choice band of them in private training for some time, and the date was now arriving for their first public effort. This experiment was baseball. In order to give the thing vogue from the start, and place it out of the reach of criticism, I chose my nines by rank, not capacity. There wasn't a knight in either team who wasn't a sceptered sovereign. As for material of this sort, there was a glut of it always around Arthur. You couldn't throw a brick in any direction and not cripple a king. Of course, I couldn't get these people to leave off their armor. They wouldn't do that when they bathed. They consented to differentiate the armor so that a body could tell one team from the other, but that was the most they would do. So one of the teams wore chain-mail ulsters, and the other wore plate armor made of my new Bessemer steel. Their practice in the field was the most fantastic thing I ever saw. Being ball-proof, they never skipped out of the way, but stood still and took the result. When a Bessemer was at the bat and a ball hit him, it would bound 150 yards sometimes. And when a man was running and threw himself on his stomach to slide to his base, it was like an ironclad coming into port. At first I appointed men of no rank to act as umpires, but I had to discontinue that. These people were no easier to please than other nines. The umpire's first decision was usually his last. They broke him in two with a bat, and his friends toted him home on a shutter. When it was noticed that no umpire ever survived a game, umpiring got to be unpopular. So I was obliged to appoint somebody whose rank and lofty position under the government would protect him. Here are the names of the nines. The Bessemers: King Arthur, King Lot of Lothian, King of Northgalis, King Marcel, King of Little Britain, King Labor, King Pelham of Listingese, King Bagdemagus, King Ptolemy Laphentis. The Ulsters: Emperor Lucius, King Logris, King Marhalt of Ireland, King Morganor, King Mark of Cornwall, King Nentrus of Garlot, King Melodus of Lyons, King of the Lake, and the Sodan of Syria. The umpire, Clarence. The first public game would certainly draw 50,000 people, and for solid fun would be worth going around the world to see. Everything would be favorable. It was balmy and beautiful spring weather now, and nature was all tailored out in her new clothes. End of chapter 40. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 41. The Interdict. However, my attention was suddenly snatched from such matters. Our child began to lose ground again, and we had to go sitting up with her. Her case became so serious. We couldn't bear to allow anybody to help in this service, so we two stood watch and watch, day in and day out. Oh, Sandy. What a right heart she had. How simple and genuine and good she was. She was a flawless wife and mother, and yet I had married her for no other particular reasons, except that by the customs of chivalry, she was my property until some knight should win her from me in the field. She had hunted Britain over for me, had found me at the hanging bout outside of London, and had straightway resumed her old place at my side in the placidest way and as of right. I was a New Englander, and in my opinion this sort of partnership would compromise her, sooner or later. She couldn't see how, but I cut argument short, and we had a wedding. Now I didn't know I was drawing a prize, yet that was what I did draw. Within the 12-month I became her worshipper, and ours was the dearest and perfectest comradeship that ever was. People talk about beautiful friendships between two persons of the same sex. What is the best of that sort, as compared with the friendship of man and wife, where the best impulses and highest ideals of both are the same? There is no place for comparison between the two friendships. The one is earthly, the other divine. In my dreams, along at first, I still wandered 13 centuries away, and my unsatisfied spirit went calling and harking all up and down the unreplying vacancies of a vanished world. Many a time Sandy heard that imploring cry come from my lips in my sleep. With a grand magnanimity she saddled that cry of mine upon our child, conceiving it to be the name of some lost darling of mine. It touched me to tears, and it also nearly knocked me off my feet, too. when she smiled up in my face for an earnest reward, and played her quaint and pretty surprise on me. "The name of one who is dear to thee is here preserved, here made holy, and the music of it will abide alway in our ears. Now thou'lt kiss me, as knowing the name I have given the child." But I didn't know it, all the same. I hadn't an idea in the world, but it would have been cruel to confess it and spoil her pretty game. So I never let on, but said, "Yes, I know, sweetheart, how dear and good it is of you, too. But I want to hear these lips of yours, which are also mine, utter it first. Then its music will be perfect." Pleased to the marrow, she murmured, "Hello, Central." I didn't laugh. I am always thankful for that. But the strain ruptured every cartilage in me, and for weeks afterward I could hear my bones clack when I walked. She never found out her mistake. The first time she heard that form of salute used at the telephone, she was surprised, and not pleased, but I told her I had given order for it, and that henceforth and forever the telephone must always be invoked with that reverent formality, in perpetual honor and remembrance of my lost friend and her small namesake. This was not true, but it answered. Well, during 2 weeks and a half we watched by the crib, and in our deep solicitude we were unconscious of any world outside that sick-room. Then our reward came. The center of the universe turned the corner and began to mend. Grateful? It isn't the term. There isn't any term for it. You know that yourself if you've watched your child through the valley of the shadow, and seen it come back to life and sweep night out of the earth with one all-illuminating smile that you could cover with your hand. Why, we were back in this world in one instant. Then we looked the same startled thought into each other's eyes at the same moment. More than 2 weeks gone, and that ship not back yet. In another minute I appeared in the presence of my train. I had been steeped in troubled bodings all this time. Their faces showed it. I called an escort, and we galloped 5 miles to a hilltop overlooking the sea. Where was my great commerce that so lately had made these glistening expanses populous and beautiful with its white-winged flocks? Vanished, every one. Not a sail from verge to verge, not a smoke-bank, just a dead and empty solitude. In place of all that brisk and breezy life. I went swiftly back, saying not a word to anybody. I told Sandy this ghastly news. We could imagine no explanation that would begin to explain. Had there been an invasion? An earthquake? A pestilence? Had the nation been swept out of existence? But guessing was profitless. I must go, at once. I borrowed the King's Navy, a ship no bigger than a steam launch, and was soon ready. The parting. Yes, that was hard. As I was devouring the child with last kisses, it brisked up and jabbered out its vocabulary. The first time in more than 2 weeks, and it made fools of us for joy. The darling mispronunciations of childhood. Dear me, there is no music that can touch it, and how one grieves when it wastes away and dissolves into correctness, knowing it will never visit his bereaved ear again. Well, how good it was to be able to carry that gracious memory away with me. I approached England the next morning, with the wide highway of salt water all to myself. There were ships in the harbor at Dover, but they were naked as to sails, and there was no sign of life about them. It was Sunday, yet at Canterbury the streets were empty. Strangest of all, there was not even a priest in sight, and no stroke of a bell fell upon my ear. The mournfulness of death was everywhere. I couldn't understand it. At last, in the further edge of that town I saw a small funeral procession, just a family and a few friends following a coffin, no priest. A funeral without bell, book, or candle. There was a church there, close at hand, but they passed it by weeping, and did not enter it. I glanced up at the belfry, and there hung the bell, shrouded in black, and its tongue tied back. Now I knew. Now I understood the stupendous calamity that had overtaken England. Invasion? Invasion is a triviality to it. It was the interdict. I asked no questions. I didn't need to ask any. The church had struck. The thing for me to do was to get into a disguise and go warily. One of my servants gave me a suit of clothes, and when we were safe beyond the town I put them on, and from that time I traveled alone. I could not risk the embarrassment of company. A miserable journey. A desolate silence everywhere, even in London itself. The traffic had ceased. Men did not talk or laugh or go in groups, or even in couples. They moved aimlessly about, each man by himself with his head down, and woe and terror at his heart. The tower showed recent war scars. Verily, much had been happening. Of course I meant to take the train for Camelot. Train! Why, the station was as vacant as a cavern. I moved on. The journey of Camelot was a repetition of what I had already seen. The Monday and the Tuesday differed in no way from the Sunday. I arrived far in the night. From being the best electric-lighted town in the kingdom, and the most like a recumbent sun of anything you ever saw, it was become simply a blot upon darkness. That is to say, it was darker and solider than the rest of the darkness, and so you could see it a little better. It made me feel as if maybe it was symbolical, a sort of sign that the church was going to keep the upper hand now, and snuff out all my beautiful civilization just like that. I found no life stirring in the somber streets. I groped my way with a heavy heart. The vast castle loomed black upon the hilltop, not a spark visible about it. The drawbridge was down, the great gate stood wide. I entered without challenge, my own heels making the only sound I heard, and it was sepulchral enough in those huge vacant courts. End of Chapter 41. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 42. War. I found Clarence alone in his quarters, drowned in melancholy, and in place of the electric light he had reinstituted the ancient grag lamp, and sat there in a grisly twilight with all curtains drawn tight. He sprang up and rushed for me eagerly, saying, "Oh, it's worth 1,000,000,000 milrays to look upon a live person again." He knew me as easily as if I hadn't been disguised at all, which frightened me. One may easily believe that. "Quick now, tell me everything of this fearful disaster," I said. "How did it come about?" "Well, if there hadn't been any Queen Guinevere, it wouldn't have come so early, but it would have come anyway. It would have come on your own account by and by. By luck it happened to come on the Queen's." "And Sir Lancelot's?" "Just so. Give me the details." "I reckon you will grant that during some years there has been only one pair of eyes in these kingdoms that has not been looking steadily askance at the Queen and Sir Lancelot." "Yes, King Arthur's." "And only one heart that was without suspicion." "Yes, the King's. A heart that isn't capable of thinking evil of a friend." "Well, the King might have gone on, still happy and unsuspecting, to the end of his days, but for one of your modern improvements, the stock-board. When you left, 3 miles of the London, Canterbury, and Dover were ready for the rails, and also ready and ripe for manipulation in the stock market. It was wildcat, and everybody knew it. The stock was for sale at a give-away. What does Sir Lancelot do but— Yes, I know. He quietly picked up nearly all of it for a song. Then he bought about twice as much more, deliverable upon call, and he was about to call when I left. Very well, he did call. The boys couldn't deliver. Oh, he had them, and he just settled his grip and squeezed them. They were laughing in their sleeves over their smartness in selling stock to him at 15 and 16 and along there that wasn't worth 10. Well, when they had laughed long enough on that side of their mouths, they rested up that side by shifting the laugh to the other side. And that was when they compromised with the Invincible at 283. Good land! He skinned them alive, and they deserved it. Anyway, the whole kingdom rejoiced. Well, among the flayed were Sir Agravaine and Sir Mordred, nephews to the king. End of the first act. The second act, scene first, an apartment in Carlisle Castle, where the court had gone for a few days' hunting. Persons present, the whole tribe of the king's nephews. Mordred and Agravaine proposed to call the guileless Arthur's attention to Guinevere and Sir Lancelot. Sir Gawaine and Sir Gareth and Sir Gaheris will have nothing to do with it. A dispute ensues, with loud talk. In the midst of it enter the king. Mordred and Agravaine sprang their devastating tale upon him. Tableau. A trap is laid for Lancelot by the king's command, and Sir Lancelot walks into it. He made it sufficiently uncomfortable for the ambushed witnesses, to wit, Mordred, Agravaine, and 12 knights of lesser rank, for he killed every one of them but Mordred. But of course that couldn't straighten matters between Lancelot and the king, and didn't. Oh dear, only one thing could result, I see that: war, and the knights of the realm divided into a king's party and a Sir Lancelot's party. Yes, that was the way of it. The king sent the queen to the stake, proposing to purify her with fire. Lancelot and his knights rescued her, and in doing it slew certain good old friends of yours and mine, in fact some of the best we ever had, to wit, Sir Bellas de Orgulais, Sir Sagwardis, Sir Griflet le Filet de Leu, Sir Brandiles, Sir Arglevaile. Oh, you tear out my heartstrings! Wait, I'm not done yet. Sir Tor, Sir Gauter, Sir Gillimer, the very best man in my subordinate 9. What a handy right fielder he was. Sir Reynolds' 3 brothers, Sir Damus, Sir Priamus, Sir Kay, the stranger. My peerless shortstop, I've seen him catch a daisy-cutter in his teeth. Come, I can't stand this. Sir Driant, Sir Lambegus, Sir Hemedine, Sir Petalope, Sir Paramondes, and whom do you think? Rush, go on. Sir Gaheris and Sir Gareth both. Oh, incredible! Their love for Lancelot was indestructible. Well, it was an accident. They were simply onlookers. They were unarmed, and were merely there to witness the queen's punishment. Sir Lancelot smote down whoever came in the way of his blind fury, and he killed these without noticing who they were. Here is an instantaneous photograph one of our boys got of the battle. It's for sale on every newsstand. There, the figures nearest the queen are Sir Lancelot with his sword up, and Sir Gareth gasping his last breath. You can catch the agony in the queen's face through the curling smoke. It's a rattling battle picture. Indeed it is. We must take good care of it. Its historical value is incalculable. Go on. Well, the rest of the tale is just war, pure and simple. Lancelot retreated to his own town and castle of Joyous Gard, and gathered there a great following of knights. The king, with a great host, went there, and there was desperate fighting during several days, and, as a result, all the plain around was paved with corpses and cast iron. Then the church patched up a peace between Arthur and Lancelot, and the queen and everybody. Everybody but Sir Gawaine. He was bitter about the slaying of his brothers, Gareth and Gaheris, and would not be appeased. He notified Lancelot to get him thence, and make swift preparation, and look to be soon attacked. So Lancelot sailed to his duchy of Gawaine with his following, and Gawaine soon followed with an army, and he beguiled Arthur to go with him. Arthur left the kingdom in Sir Mordred's hands until you should return. Ah, a king's customary wisdom. Yes, Sir Mordred set himself at once to work to make his kingship permanent. He was going to marry Guinevere as a first move, but she fled and shut herself up in the Tower of London. Mordred attacked. The Bishop of Canterbury dropped down on him with the interdict. The king returned. Mordred fought him at Dover, at Canterbury, and again at Barham Down. Then there was talk of peace and a composition. Terms: Mordred to have Cornwall and Kent during Arthur's life, and the whole kingdom afterward. Well, upon my word, my dream of a republic to be a dream, and so remain. Yes, The two armies lay near Salisbury. Gawaine's head is at Dover Castle. He fell in the fight there. Gawaine appeared to Arthur in a dream, at least his ghost did, and warned him to refrain from conflict for a month, let the delay cost what it might. But battle was precipitated by an accident. Arthur had given order that if a sword was raised during the consultation over the proposed treaty with Mordred, sound the trumpet and fall on, for he had no confidence in Mordred. Mordred had given a similar order to his people. Well, by and by an adder bit a knight's heel. The knight forgot all about the order, and made a slash at the adder with his sword. Inside half a minute those two prodigious hosts came together with a crash. They butchered away all day. Then the king, however— we have started something fresh since you left. Our paper has. No, what is that? War correspondence. Why, that's good. Yes, the paper was booming right along, for the interdict made no impression. It got no grip while the war lasted. I had war correspondence with both armies. I will finish that battle by reading you what one of the boys says. Then the king looked about him, and then was he ware of all his host, and of all his good knights were left no more on live but two knights. That was Sir Lucan de Butlers, and his brother Sir Belvedere, and they were full sore wounded. Jesu mercy, said the king, where are all my noble knights becomen? Alas, that ever I should see this doleful day. For now, said Arthur, I am come to mine end. But would to God that I wist where were that traitor Sir Mordred that hath caused all this mischief. Then was King Arthur where Sir Mordred leaned upon his sword among a great heap of dead men. Now give me my spear, said Arthur unto Sir Lucan, for yonder I have espied the traitor that all this woe hath wrought. Sir, let him be, said Sir Lucan, for he is unhappy, and if ye pass this unhappy day, ye shall be right well revenged upon him. Good Lord, remember ye of your night's dream, and what the spirit of Sir Gawaine told you this night. Yet God of his great goodness hath preserved you hitherto. Therefore, for God's sake, my lord, leave off by this, for blessed be God ye have won the field, for here we be three on live, and with Sir Mordred is none on live. And if ye leave off now, this wicked day of destiny is past. Tide me death, betide me life, saith the king. Now I see him yonder alone, he shall never escape mine hands, for at a better avail shall I never have him. God speed you well, said Sir Belvedere. The king gat his spear in both his hands, and ran toward Sir Mordred, crying, Traitor, now is thy death day come. And when Sir Mordred heard Sir Arthur, he ran until him with his sword drawn in his hand. And then King Arthur smote Sir Mordred under the shield, with a foin of his spear through the body more than a fathom. And when Sir Mordred felt that he had his death's wound, he thrust himself with the might that he had up to the butt of King Arthur's spear. And right so he smote his father Arthur with his sword holden in both his hands on the side of the head, that the sword pierced the helmet of the brain-pan, and therewithal Sir Mordred fell stark dead to the earth, and the noble Arthur fell in swoon to the earth, and there he swooned oft times. That is a good piece of war correspondence, Clarence. You are a first-rate newspaper man. Well, is the king all right? Did he get well? Poor soul, no. He is dead. I was utterly stunned. It had not seemed to me that any wound could be mortal to him. And the queen, Clarence? She is a nun, at Almesbury. What changes, and in such a short while! It is inconceivable. What next, I wonder? I can tell you what next. Well? Stake our lives and stand by them. What do you mean by that? The church is master now. The interdict included you with Mordred. It is not to be removed while you remain alive. The clans are gathering. The church has gathered all the knights that are left alive, and as soon as you are discovered, we shall have business on our hands. Stuff! With our deadly scientific war material, with our hosts of trained— Save your breath. We haven't 60 faithful left. What are you saying? our schools, our colleges, our vast workshops, our— When those nights come, those establishments will empty themselves and go over to the enemy. Did you think you had educated the superstition out of those people?" "I certainly did think it." "Well, then, you may unthink it. They stood every strain easily, until the interdict. Since then they merely put on a bold outside. At heart they are quaking. Make up your mind to it. When the armies come, the mask will fall." "It's hard news. We are lost. They will turn our own science against us." "No, they won't." "Why?" "Because I and a handful of the faithful have blocked that game. I'll tell you what I've done, and what moved me to it. Smart as you are, the Church was smarter. It was the Church that sent you cruising, through her servants, the doctors." "Clarence!" "It is the truth. I know it. Every officer of your ship was the Church's picked servant, and so was every man of the crew." "Oh, come!" "It is just as I tell you. I did not find out about these things at once, but I found them out finally. Did you send me verbal information by the commander of the ship, to the effect that upon his return to you, with supplies, you were going to leave Cadiz?" "Cadiz? I haven't been at Cadiz at all." "Going to leave Cadiz and cruise in distant seas indefinitely, for the health of your family? Did you send me that word?" "Of course not. I would have written, wouldn't I?" "Naturally. I was troubled and suspicious. When the commander sailed again, I managed to ship a spy with him. I have never heard of vessel or spy since. I gave myself 2 weeks to hear from you in, then I resolved to send a ship to Cadiz. There was a reason why I didn't." "What was that?" "Our navy had suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. Also, as suddenly and as mysteriously, the railway and telegraph and telephone service ceased. The men all deserted. Poles were cut down. The Church laid a ban upon the electric light. I had to be up and doing, and straight off. Your life was safe. Nobody in these kingdoms but Merlin would venture to touch such a magician as you without 10,000 men at his back. I had nothing to think of but how to put preparations in the best trim against your coming. I felt safe myself. Nobody would be anxious to touch a pet of yours. So this is what I did. From our various works I selected all the men, boys I mean, whose faithfulness under whatsoever pressure I could swear to, and I called them together secretly, and gave them their instructions. There are 52 of them, none younger than 14, and none above 17 years old." "Why did you select boys?" "Because all the others were born in an atmosphere of superstition, and reared in it. It is in their blood and bones. We imagined we had educated it out of them. They thought so too. The interdict woke them up like a thunderclap. It revealed them to themselves, and it revealed them to me too. With boys it was different. Such as have been under our training from 7 to 10 years have had no acquaintance with the Church's terrors, and it was among these that I found my 52. As a next move, I paid a private visit to that old cave of Merlin's. Not the small one, the big one. Yes, the one where we secretly established our first great electric plant when I was projecting a miracle. Just so. And as that miracle hadn't become necessary then, I thought it might be a good idea to utilize the plant now. I've provisioned the cave for a siege. A good idea. A first-rate idea." "I think so. I placed 4 of my boys there as a guard, inside and out of sight. Nobody was to be hurt, well outside. But any attempt to enter, well, we said just let anybody try it. Then I went out into the hills and uncovered and cut the secret wires which connected your bedroom with the wires that go to the dynamite deposits under all our vast factories, mills, workshops, magazines, etc. And about midnight I and my boys turned out and connected that wire with the cave, and nobody but you and I suspects where the other end of it goes to. We laid it underground, of course, and it was all finished in a couple of hours or so. We sha'n't have to leave our fortress now when we want to blow up our civilization." "It was the right move, and a natural one. Military necessity, in the changed condition of things. Well, what changes have come. We expected to be besieged in the palace some time or other, but— However, go on." "Next we built a wire fence." "Wire fence?" "Yes, you dropped the hint of it yourself 2 or 3 years ago." "Oh, I remember the time the Church tried her strength against us the first time, and presently thought it was wise to wait for a hopefuller season. Well, how have you arranged the fence? I start 12 immensely strong wires, naked, not insulated, from a big dynamo in the cave. Dynamo with no brushes except a positive and a negative one. Yes, that's right. The wires go out from the cave and fence in a circle of level ground 100 yards in diameter. They make 12 independent fences, 10 feet apart. That is to say, 12 circles within circles, and their ends come together in the cave again. Right, go on. The fences are fastened to heavy oaken posts, only 3 feet apart, and these posts are sunk 5 feet in the ground. That is good and strong. Yes, the wires have no ground connection outside of the cave. They go out from the positive brush of the dynamo. There is a ground connection through the negative brush. The other ends of the wire return to the cave, and each is grounded independently. No, that won't do. Why? It's too expensive. Uses up force for nothing. You don't want any ground connection except for the one through the negative brush. The other end of every wire must be brought back into the cave and fastened independently, and without any ground connection. Now then, observe the economy of it. A cavalry charge hurls itself against the fence. You're using no power. You're spending no money, for there is only one ground connection till those horses come against the wire. The moment they touch it, they form a connection with the negative brush, through the ground, and drop dead. Don't you see? You're using no energy until it is needed. Your lightning is there and ready, like the load in a gun, but it isn't costing you a cent till you touch it off. Oh yes, the single ground connection. Of course! I don't know how I overlooked that. It's not only cheaper, but it's more effectual than the other way. For if wires break or get tangled, no harm is done. No, especially if we have a telltale in the cave and disconnect the broken wire. Well, go on. The Gatlings? Yes, that's arranged. In the center, in the inner circle, on a spacious platform 6 feet high, I have grouped a battery of 13 Gatling guns, and provided plenty of ammunition. That's it. They command every approach, and when the church's knights arrive, there's going to be music. The brow of the precipice over the cave? I've got a wire fence there, and a Gatling. They won't drop any rocks down on us. Well, and the glass cylinder dynamite torpedoes? That's attended to. It's the prettiest garden that was ever planted. It's a belt 40 feet wide and goes around the outer fence. Distance between it and the fence, 100 yards. Kind of neutral ground, that space is. There isn't a single square yard of that whole belt but is equipped with a torpedo. We laid them on the surface of the ground and sprinkled a layer of sand over them. It's an innocent-looking garden, but you let a man start in to hoe it once, and you'll see. You tested the torpedoes? Well, I was going to, but... But what? Why, it's an immense oversight not to apply a... Test? Yes, I know, but they're all right. I laid a few in the public road beyond our lines, and they've been tested. Oh, that alters the case. Who did it? A church committee. How kind. Yes, they came to command us to make submission. You see, they didn't really come to test the torpedoes. That was merely an incident. Did the committees make a report? Yes, they made one. You could have heard it a mile. Unanimous? That was the nature of it. After that I put up some signs, for the protection of future committees, and we have had no intruders since. Clarence, you've done a world of work, and done it perfectly. We had plenty of time for it. There wasn't any occasion for hurry. We sat silent a while, thinking. Then my mind was made up, and I said, Yes, everything is ready. Everything is ship-shape. No detail is wanting. I know what to do now. So do I. Sit down and wait. No, sir. Rise up and strike. Do you mean it? Yes, indeed. The defensive isn't my line, and the offensive is. That is, when I hold a fair hand. 2/3 as good a hand as the enemy. Oh, yes, we'll rise up and strike. That's our game. 100 to 1, you're right. When does the performance begin? Now. We'll proclaim the Republic. Well, that will precipitate things, sure enough. It will make them buzz, I tell you. England will be a hornet's nest before noon tomorrow, if the Church's hand hasn't lost its cunning, and we know it hasn't. Now you write, and I'll dictate thus. Proclamation. Be it known unto all, whereas the king having died and left no heir, it becomes my duty to continue the executive authority vested in me, until a government shall have been created and set in motion. The monarchy has lapsed. It no longer exists. By consequence, all political power has reverted to its original source, the people of the nation. With the monarchy, its several adjuncts died also. Therefore, there is no longer a nobility, no longer a privileged class, no longer an established church. All men are become exactly equal. They are upon one common level, and religion is free. A republic is hereby proclaimed, as being the natural estate of a nation when other authority has ceased. It is the duty of the British people to meet together immediately, and by their votes elect representatives and deliver into their hands the government. I signed it, The Boss, and dated it from Merlin's Cave. Clarence said, "Why, that tells where we are, and invites them to call right away." That's the idea. We strike by the proclamation. Then it's their innings. Now, have the thing set up and printed and posted right off. That is, give the order. Then, if you've got a couple of bicycles handy at the foot of the hill, ho for Merlin's Cave. I shall be ready in 10 minutes. What a cyclone there is going to be tomorrow when this piece of paper gets to work. It's a pleasant old palace, this is. I wonder if we shall ever again... But never mind about that. End of Chapter 42. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 43. The Battle of the Sand Belt. In Merlin's Cave, Clarence and I and 52 fresh, bright, well-educated, clean-minded young British boys. At dawn I sent an order to the factories and to all our great works to stop operations and remove all life to a safe distance, as everything was going to be blown up by secret mines. And no telling at what moment, therefore, vacate at once. These people knew me and had confidence in my word. They would clear out without waiting to part their hair, and I could take my own time about dating the explosion. You couldn't hire one of them to go back during the century, if the explosion was still impending. We had a week of waiting. It was not dull for me, because I was writing all the time. During the first 3 days I finished turning my old diary into this narrative form. It only required a chapter or so to bring it down to date. The rest of the week I took up in writing letters to my wife. It was always my habit to write to Sandy every day, whenever we were separate, and now I kept up the habit for love of it, and of her. Though I couldn't do anything with the letters, of course, after I had written them. But it put in the time, you see, and was almost like talking. It was almost as if I was saying, "Sandy, if you and Hello Central were here in the cave, instead of only your photographs, what good times we could have." And then, I could imagine the baby goo-gooing something out in reply, with its fists in its mouth and itself stretched across its mother's lap on its back, and she a-laughing and admiring and worshipping, and now and then tickling under the baby's chin to set it cackling, and then maybe throwing in a word of answer to me herself, and so on and so on. Well, don't you know I could sit there in the cave with my pen and keep it up that way, by the hour with them? Why, it was almost like having us all together again. I had spies out every night, of course, to get the news. Every report made things look more and more impressive. The hosts were gathering. Down all the roads and paths of England the knights were riding, and priests rode with them, to hearten these original crusaders, this being the Church's war. All the nobilities, big and little, were on their way, and all the gentry. This was all as was expected. We should thin out this sort of folk to such a degree that the people would have nothing to do but just step to the front with their republic, and... Now, what a donkey I was. Toward the end of the week I began to get this large and disenchanting fact through my head, that the mass of the nation had swung their caps and shouted for the republic for about 1 day, and there an end. The church, the nobles, and the gentry then turned one grand, all-disapproving frown upon them, and shriveled them into sheep. From that moment the sheep had begun to gather to the fold, that is to say, the camps, and offer their valueless lives and their valuable wool to the righteous cause. Why, even the very men who had lately been slaves were in the righteous cause, and glorifying it, praying for it, sentimentally slabbering over it, just like all the other commoners. Imagine such human muck as this. Conceive of this folly. Yes, it was now death to the Republic everywhere, not a dissenting voice. All England was marching against us. Truly, this was more than I had bargained for. I watched my 52 boys narrowly, watched their faces, their walk, their unconscious attitudes. For all these are a language given us purposely that it may betray us in times of emergency, when we have secrets which we want to keep. I knew that thought would keep saying itself over and over again in their minds and hearts. All England is marching against us, and ever more strenuously and imploring attention with each repetition, ever more sharply realizing itself to their imaginations, until even in their sleep they would find no rest from it, but hear the vague and flitting creatures of the dream say, all England is marching against you. I knew all this would happen. I knew that ultimately the pressure would become so great that it would compel utterance. Therefore I must be ready with an answer at that time, an answer well chosen and tranquilizing. I was right. The time came. They had to speak. Poor lads, it was pitiful to see. They were so pale, so worn, so troubled. At first their spokesman could hardly find voice or words, but he presently got both. And this is what he said, and he put it in the neat modern English taught to him in my schools. We have tried to forget what we are, English boys. We have tried to put reason before sentiment, duty before love. Our minds approve, but our hearts reproach us. Well, apparently it was only the nobility, only the gentry, only the 25 or 30,000 knights left alive out of the late wars. We were of one mind, and undisturbed by any troubling doubt. Each and every one of these 52 lads who stand here before you said, they have chosen, it is their affair. But think. The matter is altered. All England is marching against us. Oh, sir, consider. Reflect. These are our people. They are bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh. We love them. Do not ask us to destroy our nation. Well, it shows the value of looking ahead, and being ready for a thing when it happens. If I hadn't foreseen this thing and been fixed, that boy would have had me. I couldn't have said a word. But I was fixed. I said, my boys, your hearts are in the right place. You have thought the worthy thought. You have done the worthy thing. You are English boys. You will remain English boys. You will keep that name unsmirched. Give yourselves no further concern. Let your minds be at peace. Consider this. While all England is marching against us, who is in the van? Who, by the commonest rules of war, will march in the front? Answer me. The mounted host of mailed knights? True. They are 30,000 strong. Acres deep they will march. No, observe, none but they will ever strike the sand-belt. Then there will be an episode. Immediately after that, the civilian multitude in the rear will retire, to meet business engagements elsewhere. None but nobles and gentry are knights, and none but these will remain to dance to our music after that episode. It is absolutely true that we shall have to fight nobody but these 30,000 knights. Now speak, and it shall be as you decide. Shall we avoid the battle? Retire from the field? No! The shout was unanimous and hearty. Are you well afraid of these 30,000 knights? That joke brought out a good laugh. The boys' troubles vanished away, and they went gaily to their posts. They were a darling 52. As pretty as girls, too. I was ready for the enemy now. Let the approaching big day come along. It would find us on deck. The big day arrived on time. At dawn the sentry on watch in the corral came into the cave and reported a moving black mass under the horizon, and a faint sound which he thought to be military music. Breakfast was just ready. We sat down and ate it. This over, I made the boys a little speech, and then sent out a detail to man the battery, with Clarence in command of it. The sun rose presently, and sent its unobstructed splendors over the land, and we saw a prodigious host moving slowly toward us, with the steady drift and aligned front of a wave of the sea. Nearer and nearer it came, and more sublimely imposing became its aspect. Yes, all England was there, apparently. Soon we could see the innumerable banners fluttering, and then the sun struck the sea of armor and set it all aflash. Yes, it was a fine sight. I hadn't ever seen anything to beat it. At last we could make out details. All the front ranks, no telling how many acres deep, were horsemen, plumed knights in armor. Suddenly we heard the blare of trumpets, the slow walk burst into a gallop, and then, well, it was wonderful to see. Down swept that vast horseshoe wave. It approached the sand belt. My breath stood still. Nearer, nearer. The strip of green turf beyond the yellow belt grew narrower, narrower still, became a mere ribbon in front of the horses, then disappeared under their hoofs. Great Scott! Why, the whole front of the host shot into the sky with a thunder crash, and became a whirling tempest of rags and fragments, and along the ground lay a thick wall of smoke that hid what was left of the multitude from our sight. Time for the second step in the plan of campaign. I touched a button, and shook the bones of England loose from her spine. In that explosion all our noble civilization factories went up in the air and disappeared from the earth. It was a pity, but it was necessary. We could not afford to let the enemy turn our own weapons against us. Now ensued one of the dullest quarter hours I have ever endured. We waited in a silent solitude, enclosed by our circles of wire and by a circle of heavy smoke outside of these. We couldn't see over the wall of smoke, and we couldn't see through it. But at last it began to shred away lazily, and by the end of another quarter hour the land was clear and our curiosity was enabled to satisfy itself. No living creature was in sight. We now perceived that additions had been made to our defenses. The dynamite had dug a ditch more than 100 feet wide all around us, and cast up an embankment some 25 feet high on both borders of it. As to destruction of life, it was amazing. Moreover, it was beyond estimate. Of course, we could not count the dead, because they did not exist as individuals, but merely as homogeneous protoplasm, with alloys of iron and buttons. No life was in sight, but necessarily there must have been some wounded in the rear ranks who were carried off the field under the cover of the wall of smoke. There would be sickness among others. There always is, after an episode like that. But there would be no reinforcements. This was the last stand of the chivalry of England. It was all that was left of the order after the recent annihilating wars. So I felt quite safe in believing that the utmost force that could for the future be brought against us would be but small, that is, of knights. I therefore issued a congratulatory proclamation to my army in these words: Soldiers, champions of human liberty and equality, your general congratulates you. In the pride of his strength and the vanity of his renown, an arrogant enemy came against you. You were ready. The conflict was brief, on your side, glorious. The mighty victory, having been achieved utterly without loss, stands without example in history. So long as the planets shall continue to move in their orbits, the battle of the sand belt will not perish out of the memories of men. The Boss. I read it well, and the applause I got was very gratifying to me. I then wound up with these remarks. The war with the English nation, as a nation, is at an end. The nation has retired from the field and the war. Before it can be persuaded to return, war will have ceased. This campaign is the only one that is going to be fought. It will be brief, the briefest in history. Also, the most destructive to life, considered from the standpoint of proportion of casualties to numbers engaged. We are done with the nation. Henceforth we deal only with the knights. English knights can be killed, but they cannot be conquered. We know what is before us. While one of these men remains alive, our task is not finished, the war is not ended. We will kill them all." There was loud and long-continued applause. I picketed the great embankments thrown up around our lines by the dynamite explosion, merely a lookout of a couple of boys to announce the enemy when he should appear again. Next I sent an engineer and 40 men to a point just beyond our lines in the north, to turn a mountain brook that was there, and bring it within our lines and under our command, arranging it in such a way that I could make instant use of it in an emergency. The 40 men were divided into 2 shifts of 20 each, and were to relieve each other every 2 hours. In 10 hours the work was accomplished. It was nightfall now, and I withdrew my pickets. The one who had had the northern outlook reported a camp in sight, but visible with a glass only. He also reported that a few knights had been feeling their way toward us, and had driven some cattle across our lines, but that the knights themselves had not come very near. That was what I had been expecting. They were feeling us, you see. They wanted to know if we were going to play that red terror on them again. They would grow bolder in the night, perhaps. I perceived I knew what project they would attempt, because it was plainly the thing I would attempt myself if I were in their places and as ignorant as they were. I mentioned it to Clarence. "I think you are right," said he. "It is the obvious thing for them to try." "Well, then," I said, "if they do it, they are doomed." "Certainly." "They won't have the slightest show in the world." "Of course they won't." "It's dreadful, Clarence. It seems an awful pity." The thing disturbed me so that I couldn't get any peace of mind for thinking of it and worrying over it. So at last, to quiet my conscience, I framed this message to the knights: "To the Honorable, the Commander of the Insurgent Chivalry of England, you fight in vain. We know your strength, if one may call it by that name. We know that at the utmost you cannot bring against us above 25,000 knights. Therefore you have no chance, none whatever. Reflect. We are well equipped, well fortified. We number 54. 54 what? Men? No, minds, the capablest in the world. A force against which mere animal might may no more hope to prevail than may the idle waves of the sea hope to prevail against the granite barriers of England. Be advised. We offer you your lives, for the sake of your families. Do not reject the gift. We offer you this chance, and it is the last. Throw down your arms, surrender unconditionally to the Republic, and all will be forgiven. Signed, The Boss. I read it to Clarence, and said I proposed to send it by a flag of truce. He laughed the sarcastic laugh he was born with, and said, "Somehow it seems impossible for you to ever fully realize what these nobilities are. Now let us save a little time and trouble. Consider me the commander of the knights yonder. Now then, you are the flag of truce. Approach and deliver me your message, and I will give you your answer." I humored the idea. I came forward under an imaginary guard of the enemy's soldiers, produced my paper and read it through. For answer, Clarence struck the paper out of my hand, pursed up a scornful lip, and said with lofty disdain, "Dismember me this animal, and return him in a basket to those base-born knave who sent him. Other answer have I none." How empty is theory in presence of fact! And this was just fact and nothing else. It was the thing that would have happened. There was no getting around that. I tore up the paper and granted my mistimed sentimentalities a permanent rest. Then to business. I tested the electric signals from the Gatling platform to the cave, and made sure they were all right. I tested and retested those which commanded the fences. These were signals whereby I could break and renew the electric current in each fence independently of the others at will. I placed the brook connection under the guard and authority of 3 of my best boys, who would alternate in 2-hour watches all night, and promptly obey my signal, if I should have occasion to give it. 3 revolver shots in quick succession. Sentry duty was discarded for the night, and the corral left empty of life. I ordered that quiet be maintained in the cave, and the electric lights turned down to a glimmer. As soon as it was good and dark, I shut off the current from all the fences, and then groped my way out to the embankment bordering our side of the great dynamite ditch. I crept to the top of it, and lay there on that slant of the muck to watch. but it was too dark to see anything. As for sounds, there were none. The stillness was deathlike. True, there were the usual night sounds of the country, the whir of night birds, the buzzing of insects, the barking of distant dogs, the mellow lowing of far-off kine. But these didn't seem to break the stillness. They only intensified it, and added a gruesome melancholy to it into the bargain. I presently gave up looking. The night shut down so black, but I kept my ears strained to catch the least suspicious sound, for I judged I only had to wait, and I shouldn't be disappointed. However, I had to wait a long time. At last I caught what you may call indistinct glimpses of sound, dulled metallic sound. I pricked up my ears then, and held my breath, for this was the sort of thing I had been waiting for. The sound thickened, and approached from toward the north. Presently I heard it at my own level, the ridge top of the opposite embankment, 100 feet or more away. Then I seemed to see a row of black dots appear along that ridge. Human heads? I couldn't tell. It mightn't be anything at all. You can't depend on your eyes when your imagination is out of focus. However, the question was soon settled. I heard that metallic noise descending into the great ditch. It augmented fast, it spread all along, and it unmistakably furnished me this fact. An armed host was taking up its quarters in the ditch. Yes, these people were arranging a little surprise party for us. We could expect entertainment about dawn, possibly earlier. I groped my way back to the corral now. I had seen enough. I went to the platform and signaled to turn the current on to the 2 inner fences. Then I went into the cave and found everything satisfactory there, nobody awake but the working watch. I woke Clarence and told him the great ditch was filling up with men, and that I believed all the knights were coming for us in a body. It was my notion that as soon as dawn approached we could expect the ditch's ambuscaded thousands to swarm up over the embankment and make an assault, and be followed immediately by the rest of their army. Clarence said, "They will be wanting to send a scout or 2 in the dark to make preliminary observations. Why not take the lightning off the outer fences and give them a chance?" "I've already done it, Clarence. Did you ever know me to be inhospitable?" "No, you are a good heart. I want to go and be a reception committee. I will go too." We crossed the corral and lay down together between the 2 inside fences. Even the dim light of the cave had disordered our eyesight somewhat, but the focus straightway began to regulate itself, and soon it was adjusted for present circumstances. We had had to feel our way before, but we could make out to see the fence posts now. We started a whispered conversation, but suddenly Clarence broke off and said, "What is that?" "What is what?" "That thing yonder." "What thing? Where?" "There, beyond you a little piece. Dark something, a dull shape of some kind, against the second fence." I gazed, and he gazed. I said, "Could it be a man, Clarence?" "No, I think not. If you notice, it looks Why, it is a man, leaning on the fence." "I certainly believe it is. Let us go and see." We crept along on our hands and knees until we were pretty close, and then looked up. Yes, it was a man. A dim, great figure in armor, standing erect with both hands on the upper wire, and, of course, there was a smell of burning flesh. Poor fellow, dead as a doornail. I never knew what hurt him. He stood there like a statue, no motion about him except that his plumes swished about a little in the night wind. We rose up and looked in through the bars of his visor, but couldn't make out whether we knew him or not, features too dim and shadowed. We heard muffled sounds approaching, and we sank down to the ground where we were. We made out another knight vaguely, and he was coming very stealthily and feeling his way. He was near enough now for us to see him put out a hand, find an upper wire, and then bend and step under it and over the lower one. Now he arrived at the first knight, and started slightly when he discovered him. He stood a moment, no doubt wondering why the other one didn't move on. Then he said in a low voice, "Why dreamest thou here, good Sir Mark—" Then he laid his hand on the corpse's shoulder, and just uttered a little soft moan and sunk down dead. Killed by a dead man, you see. Killed by a dead friend, in fact. There was something awful about it. These early birds came scattering along after each other, about one every 5 minutes in our vicinity, during half an hour. They brought no armor of offense but their swords. As a rule, they carried the sword ready in the hand, and put it forward and found the wires with it. We would now and then see a blue spark when the knight that caused it was so far away as to be invisible to us, but we knew what had happened all the same. Poor fellow, he had touched a charged wire with his sword and been elected. We had brief intervals of grim stillness, interrupted with piteous regularity by the clash made by the falling of an ironclad, and this sort of thing was going on, right along, and was very creepy there in the dark and loneliness. We concluded to make a tour between the inner fences. We elected to walk upright for convenience sake. We argued that, if discerned, we should be taken for friends rather than enemies, and in any case we should be out of reach of swords, and these gentry did not seem to have any spears along. Well, it was a curious trip. Everywhere dead men were laying outside the second fence, not plainly visible, but still visible. And we counted 15 of those pathetic statues, dead knights standing with their hands on the upper wire. One thing seemed to be sufficiently demonstrated. Our current was so tremendous that it killed before the victim could cry out. Pretty soon we detected a muffled and heavy sound, and next moment we guessed what it was. It was a surprise in force coming. Whispered Clarence to go and wake the army, and notify it to wait in silence in the cave for further orders. He was soon back, and we stood by the inner fence and watched the silent lightning do its awful work upon that swarming host. One could make out but little of detail, but he could note that a black mass was piling itself up beyond the second fence. The swelling bulk was dead men. Our camp was enclosed with a solid wall of the dead, a bulwark, a breastwork of corpses, you may say. One terrible thing about this was the absence of human voices. There were no cheers, no war cries. Being intent upon a surprise, these men moved as noiselessly as they could, and always when the front rank was near enough to the goal to make it proper for them to begin to get a shout ready, of course they struck the fatal line and went down without testifying. I sent a current through the third fence now, and almost immediately through the fourth and fifth. So quickly were the gaps filled up. I believe the time was come now for my climax. I believe that the whole army was in our trap. Anyway, it was high time to find out, so I touched a button and sent 50 electric suns aflame on the top of our precipice. Land, what a sight! We were enclosed in 3 walls of dead men. All the other fences were pretty nearly filled with the living, who were stealthily working their way forward through the wires. And the sudden glare paralyzed this host, petrified them, you may say, with astonishment. There was just one instant for me to utilize their immobility in, and I didn't lose the chance. You see, in another instant they would have recovered their faculties, and then they'd have burst into a cheer and made a rush, and my wires would have gone down before it. But that lost instant lost them their opportunity forever. While even that slight fragment of time was still unspent, I shot the current through all the fences and struck the whole host dead in their tracks. There was a groan you could hear. It voiced the death pang of 11,000 men. It swelled out on the night with awful pathos. A glance showed that the rest of the enemy, perhaps 10,000 strong, were between us and the encircling ditch, and pressed forward to the assault. Consequently, we had them all, and had them past help. Time for the last act of the tragedy. I fired the 3 appointed revolver shots, which meant, turn on the water. There was a sudden rush and roar, and in a minute the mountain brook was raging through the big ditch and creating a river 100 feet wide and 25 deep. Stand to your guns, men! Open fire! The 13 Gatlings began to vomit death into the fated 10,000. They halted. They stood their ground a moment against that withering deluge of fire. Then they broke, faced about, and swept toward the ditch like chaff before a gale. A full 4th part of their force never reached the top of the lofty embankment. The 3/4 reached it and plunged over, to death by drowning. Within 10 short minutes after we had opened fire, armed resistance was totally annihilated. The campaign was ended. We 54 were masters of England. 25,000 men lay dead around us. But how treacherous is fortune! In a little while, say an hour, happened a thing, by my own fault, which— but I have no heart to write that. Let the record end here. End of Chapter 43. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This is a recording by Steve Anderson of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Chapter 44. A Postscript by Clarence. I, Clarence, must write it for him. He proposed that we two go out and see if any help could be accorded the wounded. I was strenuous against the project. I said that if there were many, we could do but little for them, and it would not be wise for us to trust ourselves among them anyway. But he could seldom be turned from a purpose once formed, so we shut off the electric current from the fences, took an escort along, climbed over the enclosing ramparts of dead knights, and moved out upon the field. The first wounded Mall who appealed for help was sitting with his back against a dead comrade. When the boss bent over him and spoke to him, the man recognized him and stabbed him. That knight was Sir Meliagraunce, as I found out by tearing off his helmet. He will not ask for help any more. We carried the boss to the cave and gave his wound, which was not very serious, the best care we could. In this service we had the help of Merlin, though we did not know it. He was disguised as a woman, and appeared to be a simple old peasant goodwife. In this disguise, with brown-stained face and smooth-shaven, he had appeared a few days after the boss was hurt and offered to cook for us, saying her people had gone off to join certain new camps which the enemy were forming, and that she was starving. The boss had been getting along very well, and had amused himself with finishing up his record. We were glad to have this woman, for we were short-handed. We were in a trap, you see, a trap of our own making. If we stayed where we were, our dead would kill us. If we moved out of our defenses, we should no longer be invincible. We had conquered. In turn, we were conquered. The boss recognized this. We all recognized it. If we could go to one of those new camps and patch up some kind of terms with the enemy— yes, but the boss could not go, and neither could I, for I was among the first that were made sick by the poisonous air bred by those dead thousands. Others were taken down, and still others. Tomorrow is here, and with it the end. About midnight I awoke, and saw that hag making curious passes in the air about the boss's head and face, and wondered what it meant. Everybody but the dynamo watch lay steeped in sleep. There was no sound. The woman ceased from her mysterious foolery, and started tiptoeing toward the door. I called out, "Stop! What have you been doing?" She halted, and said, with an accent of malicious satisfaction, "Ye were conquerors, ye are conquered. These others are perishing, you also. Ye shall die in this place, every one except him. He sleepeth now, and shall sleep 13 centuries. I am Merlin." Then such a delirium of silly laughter overtook him that he reeled about like a drunken man, and presently fetched up against one of our wires. His mouth is spread open yet. Apparently he is still laughing. I suppose the face will retain that petrified laugh until the corpse turns to dust. The boss has never stirred. Sleeps like a stone. If he does not wake today, we shall understand what kind of a sleep it is, and his body will then be borne to a place in one of the remote recesses of the cave where none will ever find it to desecrate it. As for the rest of us, well, it is agreed that if any one of us ever escapes alive from this place, he will write the fact here, and loyally hide the manuscript with the boss, our dear, good chief, whose property it is, be he alive or dead. End of the manuscript. Final postscript by Mark Twain. The dawn was come when I slid the manuscript aside. The rain had almost ceased. The world was gray and sad. The exhausted storm was sighing and sobbing itself to rest. I went to the stranger's room and listened at his door, which was slightly ajar. I could hear his voice, and so I knocked. There was no answer, but I still heard the voice. I peeped in. The man lay on his back in bed, talking brokenly but with spirit, and punctuating with his arms, which he thrashed about restlessly as sick people do in delirium. I slipped in softly and bent over him. His mutterings and ejaculations went on. I spoke merely a word to call his attention. His glassy eyes and his ashy face were alight in an instant with pleasure, gratitude, gladness, welcome. "Oh, Sandy, you are come at last! How I have longed for you! Sit by me. Do not leave me. Never leave me again, Sandy, never again. Where is your hand? Give it me, dear. Let me hold it there. Now all is well. All is peace, and I am happy again. We are happy again. Isn't it so, Sandy? You are so dim, so vague. You are but a mist, a cloud, but you are here, and that is blessedness sufficient. And I have your hand. Don't take it away. It is for only a little while. I shall not require it long. Was that the child? Hello, Central? She doesn't answer. Asleep, perhaps? Bring her when she wakes, and let me touch her hands, her face, her hair, and tell her good-bye. Sandy. Yes, you are there. I lost myself a moment, and I thought you were gone. Have I been sick long? It must be so. It seems months to me. And such dreams, such strange and awful dreams. Sandy, dreams that were as real as reality. Delirium, of course, but so real. Why, I thought the king was dead. I thought you were in Gaul and couldn't get home. I thought there was a revolution. In the fantastic frenzy of these dreams, I thought that Clarence and I and a handful of my cadets fought and exterminated the whole chivalry of England. But even that was not the strangest. I seemed to be a creature out of a remote unborn age, centuries hence, and even that was as real as the rest. Yes, I seemed to have flown back out of that age into this of ours, and then forward to it again, and was set down a stranger and forlorn in that strange England, with an abyss of 13 centuries yawning between me and you, between me and my home and my friends, between me and all that is dear to me, all that could make life worth the living. It was awful, awfuler than you can ever imagine, Sandy. Oh, watch by me, Sandy. Stay by me every moment. Don't let me go out of my mind again. Death is nothing. Let it come, but not with those dreams, not with the torture of those hideous dreams. I cannot endure that again. Sandy? He lay muttering incoherently some little time. Then for a time he lay silent, and apparently sinking away toward death. Presently his fingers began to pick busily at the coverlet, and by that sign I knew that his end was at hand. With the first suggestion of the death rattle in his throat, he started up slightly, and seemed to listen. Then he said, "A bugle? It is the king! The drawbridge there! Man the battlements! Turn out the—" He was getting up his last effect, but he never finished it. End of chapter 44. End of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Read by Steve Anderson in Dubuque, Iowa, in the snowy advent of 2005.